Good evening, and welcome to the History Dreaming. Tonight, the Empire awakens, stone by stone, echo by echo. The Roman world was not built in a day, but it lasted long enough to dream itself eternal. Its legions carved roads across continents. Its language shaped law, faith, and memory. From marble palaces to dusty frontiers, Rome ruled both the world and the imagination. But every empire carries its twilight. The same roads that brought conquest would one day lead to ruin. And yet, in every crumbling arch, you can still hear the heartbeat of ambition. So lie back and let the centuries march softly past. This is boring history for sleep, where the empire never truly falls, it simply dreams beneath the moonlight. I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought in the comments. The world was still half asleep when destiny stirred along the banks of the Tiber. Mist coiled over the water like a living veil, hiding the quiet breath of newborn gods. Two infants floated in a fragile basket, their cries swallowed by the endless hum of nature. The river glimmered like molten glass under the moon, carrying them between reeds that whispered of fate. It was not a mother's hand that guided them, but something older, something patient and cruel. The stars above Rome's unborn heart pulsed faintly, as if keeping time with the children's heartbeat. The current bent around them gently, unwilling to destroy what the future demanded. For in that fragile moment between drowning and deliverance, the empire's pulse began to stir. The basket came to rest at the edge of the wild, where the forest met the shore like two rival realms. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the faint metallic tang of dawn. There, a she-wolf emerged from shadow, ribs sharp beneath her fur, eyes burning with a hunger that was half mercy, half instinct. Her breath clouded in the chill morning, heavy with the smell of life and decay. She lowered her head to the basket and sniffed at the trembling flesh inside. In that instant, hunger became devotion. She did not see prey. She saw continuity, a rhythm older than her kind. The wild, it seemed, bowed to prophecy that night. The twins clung to her warmth as she lay down beside them, the steady thrum of her heart drowning their cries. Her milk carried the memory of all who had fought and lived beneath the same moon. The forest hushed, and even the wind seemed to circle in reverence. The wolf licked their foreheads as if sealing a covenant between beast and man. Overhead, the branches swayed, scattering pale light upon their faces like the blessing of unseen gods. For the gods of early Rome were not yet crowned with gold. They lived in blood, breath, and endurance. The wolf's ribs rose and fell with the rhythm of eternity. When dawn finally arrived, it came not as triumph, but as revelation. The river glowed amber, its surface trembling with morning's breath. The wolf watched the horizon, eyes narrowed as if reading a script written upon the clouds. Behind her, the infants slept, their tiny hands curling into fists of promise. The earth around them steamed faintly, the warmth of survival rising into cool air. Somewhere beyond the forest, the first bird called, a single note that sounded like memory returning. The river, now calm, carried the reflection of the sky as if holding prophecy in liquid glass. The silence between each ripple felt deliberate, divine, eternal. In that silence, Rome began. Not in conquest, not in marble, but in hunger that refused to die. The wolf, the river, and the dawn became a trinity of creation. The gods watched in quiet agreement, knowing what would follow. Brother against brother, sword against dream, empire against time. Yet none of that existed yet, only the breath of survival beneath the fading stars. History would later dress it in myth, sculpt it in stone, and call it divine. But beneath it all lay this: the soft, trembling sound of a mother's growl and the first heartbeat of the Roman world. Seasons passed, and the forest grew around the twins like a cathedral of breath and shadow. The wolf that had nursed them still lingered near, though her muzzle had turned silver with time. Romulus and Remus ran through tall grass that hissed like whispers of prophecy. Their laughter echoed between oak trunks, bright and reckless, unknowing of destiny's teeth. They learned the songs of the river, the silence of predators, and the way night could hide both safety and danger. Sometimes they would sit by the water's edge, tracing shapes in the mud that looked like walls, like towers. The wind carried the scent of something unseen, the pull of civilization, faint but relentless. The forest watched as childhood began to fracture into fate. One morning, they found themselves staring at the reflection of their faces in the Tiber. The surface wavered, and for an instant, the water seemed to divide them, twin images no longer whole. Romulus touched the river with his hand, disturbing the shape of their unity. "There will be walls," he whispered without knowing why. Remus only smiled, yet his silence carried unease, as though some part of him sensed that love and rivalry shared the same heartbeat. The wolf watched from the distance, tail still, eyes reflecting two futures destined to collide. The world itself seemed to hold its breath. As years folded into youth, the twins grew strong, muscles carved by labor, skin kissed by sun and storm. They fought with sticks and hunted with stones, laughing when pain drew blood. They were mirrors of one another, fierce, stubborn, untamed. Yet beneath their shared ferocity, the seed of difference began to grow. Romulus sought order. He built fences even in the wilderness. Remus sought freedom. He broke them, laughing. The forest no longer contained them. Its shadows could not bind the shape of their ambition. The wolf began to disappear at dusk, fading into myth even as they stepped toward legend. When manhood arrived, it came not with peace, but purpose. The brothers returned to the world of humans, to the whispers of Alba Longa, to the memory of kings and exile. There they learned their blood was royal, grandsons of Numitor, heirs to a stolen throne. The fire that had slept within them woke in full. They raised arms against tyranny, toppled their usurper uncle, and freed their lineage from corruption. The people hailed them, the twins of destiny, chosen by both gods and beasts. But glory is a double-edged crown. Freedom once earned soon demanded direction, and both brothers began to dream of a city that would outlast its makers. They returned to the banks of the Tiber where their story had begun. The air smelled of damp earth and prophecy once more. Romulus traced the outline of a wall in the soil, declaring that this would be his city. Remus laughed and leapt across it, mocking the boundary. The laughter echoed through the valley like a challenge, like thunder before the storm. Words sharpened into shouts, shouts into silence, and silence into a blade. When the sword fell, it was not war. It was destiny, claiming its due. The river did not weep. It only carried the reflection of a brother standing alone. As twilight fell, Romulus stood beside his fallen twin. His hands shook, though his face was still. The wind moved through the reeds as though whispering the old wolf's farewell. Rome, the city of survival, had found its first law again. That greatness demands sacrifice. In the fading light, Romulus began to build, his heartbeat steady, his shadow long. He named the city after himself, not from pride, but as an echo of loneliness. The walls rose brick by brick, built not from stone alone, but from guilt, memory, and inevitability. Night descended over the newborn city, and the stars hung low as if to bear witness. The Tiber glowed silver, reflecting the outline of walls that would one day cradle empires. In the darkness, a howl drifted from the hills, distant, mournful, ancient. Perhaps it was the spirit of the she-wolf, or perhaps only the sound of history remembering its first mother. The city breathed for the first time, and with it began the endless rhythm of conquest and loss. The brothers were no more, but their hunger lived on, in soldiers, in kings, in every beating heart that dared to rule the world. The morning after Remus fell, the sun rose pale and unsteady, like a witness unsure of its role. The Tiber flowed quietly, its surface unbroken except for drifting leaves that turned slowly, like thoughts of guilt. Romulus knelt beside the unfinished wall, his hands streaked with both earth and memory. Around him silence gathered, heavy, expectant, sacred. The air smelled of smoke and wet clay, the scent of beginnings wrapped in mourning. No one spoke, even the birds seemed to wait, for every empire, no matter how grand, must begin with something lost. And so the first stones of Rome were laid upon the bones of brotherhood. The workers came from the hills and the valleys, drawn by promise or fear. It mattered little which. They mixed mud with straw, sang to keep rhythm, and built the walls higher under the watch of a man both haunted and chosen. Romulus moved among them like a spirit of resolve, saying little, watching much. The sun carved his shadow across the ground like an omen. At night, the fires burned along the half-formed streets, and smoke rose in thin columns toward the indifferent stars. Each ember seemed to carry a prayer, not for peace, but endurance. For peace was a foreign god in those early days. The city began as an outline of need, huts clinging to the hillside, paths marked by footsteps rather than design. Yet, even in its crudity, something eternal stirred. The clang of hammers echoed through the dusk, mingling with the hum of crickets, a rhythm that sounded almost divine. The smell of baked earth filled the air. The walls glowed orange like the skin of a living creature. Rome was not born beautiful. It was born relentless. It did not ask to be admired, only to exist, to outlast. And in that stubborn will, the gods found something familiar, something worth protecting. As the walls rose, so too did rituals, offerings to unseen powers that governed both stone and soul. Cattle were slain, smoke rose thick and sweet. The priests muttered ancient words that wrapped the air in secrecy. Romulus stood apart, head bowed, eyes hollow. He did not seek forgiveness, he sought permanence. The blood that stained the altar ran down into the soil, mingling with clay, binding sacrifice and structure into one. It was said the ground trembled, as though accepting the bargain. From that day, the city's soil was never innocent again. Every conquest would be an echo of this first offering. When night descended, Rome glimmered like a hearth. The fires along the walls shimmered through the fog, soft and breathing. Wolves howled from the distant hills, their voices crossing the river like ancestral songs. Romulus lifted his head toward the sound, and for a moment, his eyes softened, not with regret but remembrance. He whispered something only the night could hear, perhaps a name, perhaps a vow. The air carried it away toward the forest, where shadows still remembered two children sleeping beneath a mother's fur. The city, new and fragile, seemed to listen. Soon came men seeking shelter, wanderers, exiles, and thieves. Romulus welcomed them all, for a city of order must first be a refuge for chaos. They brought with them languages, tempers, and the restless ghosts of other lands. The streets grew loud with barter and quarrel, with laughter and blasphemy. Yet amid the disorder, something miraculous took shape: belonging. For even the unworthy longed to be Roman. The city's pulse quickened, its spirit thickened like storm clouds, and from its confusion rose a strange kind of harmony, the unity of the lost, building a new world from brokenness. But the gods of fate rarely allow peace to linger. From the neighboring Sabines came envy, then desire, then war. Romulus, needing women for his growing city, held a feast, and beneath celebration hid an act that would haunt his name. The Sabine daughters were taken by force, their cries mingling with music and wine. Yet from that darkness came a union neither side could undo. When the Sabine men attacked, their daughters stood between them and their captors, choosing the strange new Rome over bloodlines of old. In their tears, the empire learned its first lesson of power: even violence can birth civilization. When dawn rose after the Sabine War, the fields were littered with both the dead and the redeemed. Romulus walked among the fallen, his face unreadable, his steps slow and steady. The women watched from the walls, their veils grey with ash and dew. Somewhere in the distance a rooster called, a defiant note amid the stillness. The king raised his hand to the horizon, where sunlight touched the city's half-built temples. His lips moved soundlessly, shaping a vow that only the gods would hear. Rome would not die in his time, nor his sons, nor the sons that followed. It would live, through ashes, through cruelty, through faith. And so the city of clay hardened into something unyielding. The walls stood firm, the altars bled, and the fires never went out. Rome had been born twice, first from mercy, then from violence. Its breath was human, but its heartbeat divine. The river flowed as always, indifferent yet faithful, carrying whispers of destiny to the sea. Above, the sky stretched pale and endless, watching as one man's grief became the foundation of eternity. For Rome had no mother but hunger, no father but will, and no soul that could ever sleep. The years gathered around Romulus like a silent court of shadows. The city he had built from grief now breathed on its own, its streets pulsing with life and ambition. Market smoke curled into the dawn, and the clang of metal echoed between unfinished temples. The people called his name with reverence and fear, unsure whether to praise him as man or god. He walked among them cloaked in silence, his gaze heavy with unseen burdens. Rome had grown beyond his reach, and yet it was still his reflection, proud, restless, unmerciful. The walls he once shaped by hand now shaped him in return. He ruled from the Palatine Hill, where the wind carried the smell of both incense and iron. Below the river glimmered, the same Tiber that had once cradled his infancy. Sometimes he would stare toward the forest that birthed him, as if expecting the wolf to return. None dared ask what haunted him, but the silence around his throne often spoke for him. He was loved, but love in Rome was never tender. It was born of loyalty and fear, tempered in war. His soldiers followed without question, yet in their eyes flickered doubt. Could one mortal bear the weight of divine destiny? As seasons turned, Romulus became a figure of both legend and suspicion. The senators whispered in marble halls that the king was no longer wholly human. Some said he conversed with spirits at night, others that he planned to crown himself among the gods. Yet the people, hardened by faith and famine, clung to his name as one clings to a star in storm. They remembered how he had built their home from exile, how he had turned mud into dominion. Still, whispers are seeds, and in Rome's soil, every seed grows teeth. The line between devotion and envy thinned until even shadows seemed to watch him with hunger. One afternoon, as the sky trembled with approaching rain, Romulus called his council to the field of Mars. The clouds hung low, dark as the iron of unsheathed swords. He stood tall among them, his cloak whipping like a banner of dusk. He spoke not of conquest, but of legacy, of a Rome that must endure beyond his breath. The wind swallowed his final words, carrying them toward the mountains. Then a storm broke. Lightning split the heavens, and the field erupted in blinding light. When the vision cleared, the throne stood empty. The men fell to their knees, their cries drowned by thunder. Some said he was torn apart by his own guards. Others swore he was lifted into the sky, his mortal coil traded for immortality. The truth, as always in Rome, lay between blood and myth. The senators declared him a god, Quirinus, protector of the eternal city. Temples rose in his name, incense clouding the air with sanctified smoke. The people prayed not for mercy, but for endurance, for the strength to build and destroy as he had done. They no longer saw him as king, but as a mirror of what they might one day become, immortal through creation, not through compassion. The city mourned and celebrated in the same breath. Processions wound through the streets, torches flickering against walls still damp with rain. The scent of burning myrrh mingled with that of wet stone. Mothers whispered his story to their children, the boy of wolves, the man of war, the god of Rome. The sound of drums faded into night, replaced by the hush of wind through the arches. High above, stars emerged timidly, their light diffused by storm clouds. Somewhere in the hills a lone howl echoed, long and mournful, as if the world itself remembered the first heartbeat of empire. From that night onward, Rome stood unchallenged in spirit. Its foundations were bound by blood, its crown made of dust and devotion. The Tiber continued its endless journey, reflecting a city that had traded its innocence for permanence. Every new ruler would wear Romulus's ghost like a second skin, feeling both his triumph and his torment. In their dreams, they would see his figure standing beside the river, unbowed and unending. For Rome was no longer his creation. It had become his echo, infinite, unrelenting, and utterly awake within history's sleep. And so ended the age of the wolf and the fire, the first breath of empire, the last heartbeat of myth. The forests that once sheltered gods began to recede, and the hum of civilization replaced the song of the wild. Yet beneath the marble, beneath the prayers, the old hunger still lingered, the hunger to survive, to build, to be remembered. Rome was born not to conquer the world, but to conquer oblivion. Its first crown was not gold but dust, and in that dust lay the promise of eternity. The death of Romulus left the air of Rome heavy and uncertain. The city stood between worlds, half myth, half flesh. The people spoke his name in reverence, but their eyes turned toward the empty throne. Smoke rose from temple altars, and the scent of burnt offerings mingled with the dampness of stone. Without a ruler, the streets grew restless, echoing with debates, prayers, and superstition. Rome had a body, but no heartbeat, a city too young to stand still. The senators gathered at twilight, their robes dragging through the dust that once bore the king's footsteps. In their silence lingered a single truth. The wolf's children had built a kingdom, but men must learn to govern it. Out of the stillness came the first attempt at order. They created an interregnum, a council of kings who ruled by turn, each holding power for days, not years. The people accepted it, though uneasily, for no voice could yet match the thunder of Romulus. The city grew in cautious rhythm, its laws unwritten but felt. Torches burned through the night, lighting the forum where disputes echoed against stone. Markets reopened, soldiers trained, and priests chanted under the pale sky. Rome did not crumble. It adapted, waiting for a name to carry it forward. For even in its infancy, it knew how to survive uncertainty, as it had survived birth, hunger, and blood. Then, from the city of Alba Longa, came a man of quiet strength, Numa Pompilius. Unlike Romulus, he carried no sword, no thirst for conquest. His hands were calloused from labor, not war. He spoke softly, and when he listened, even the wind seemed to pause. The senators saw in him what Rome needed, not another founder of walls, but a builder of souls. They placed upon his head the laurel crown of kingship, though he accepted it as one accepts a burden, not a blessing. Under his rule, the city of clay would learn patience. The fires of war would cool, replaced by the slow rhythm of ritual. Numa's reign began at dawn under skies the color of wet bronze. The priests led him to the sacred grove, where the air shimmered with incense and dew. There, before the altars of the old gods, he vowed not to expand the city's borders, but to deepen its spirit. He built temples to unseen forces, to faith, to boundaries, to Janus, guardian of beginnings. For he believed a city could not rule others until it had learned to rule itself. The people watched as new rituals took root, each prayer a thread binding man to meaning. Rome, once wild and blood-fed, began to breathe more slowly, as if discovering the rhythm of reflection. The fields beyond the walls flourished under his quiet laws. Farmers found peace in routine, and shepherds sang hymns instead of war songs. Festivals replaced feasts of conquest. The sound of music drifted across the hills. Numa walked among his people without guards, speaking of harmony between man and nature. Yet beneath this peace stirred a sacred tension, the calm before Rome's next awakening. For even as the city slept under the spell of order, destiny gathered beyond its borders. The gods who had once roared through fire now whispered in dreams. The empire to be was learning restraint, not out of weakness but preparation. When night fell, the temples glowed like constellations scattered across the earth. Incense curled into the stars, carrying prayers from the living to the divine. Numa sat alone within the temple of Vesta, watching the eternal flame flicker. Its light painted his face in hues of gold and sorrow. He knew that peace, though sacred, was never permanent. It was merely the breath between storms. His rule would become legend, yet he sensed that Rome's true nature lay dormant beneath the calm. The hunger of the wolf still slept beneath the marble, dreaming of fire. The city woke to the sound of bells, not war horns. Their tone was softer, made to remind, not command. Under Numa's reign, Rome began to speak a new language, one written in silence, patience, and ritual. The king taught that true strength was measured not in conquest, but in order. Priests walked the streets in white wool, their steps slow and deliberate, their eyes fixed on the heavens. The smell of burning cedar filled the air, drifting between the temples like thought made visible. Markets hushed when the sacred processions passed. The people learned reverence the way fields learn sunlight, gradually, quietly, until it became instinct. The empire's pulse slowed, and for the first time, Rome exhaled. Numa's laws were not carved in stone, but spoken through repetition. each ceremony a reminder of cosmic rhythm. He declared that every action, from ploughing a field to swearing an oath, must mirror the order of the universe. To him, governance was a kind of worship, a harmony between mortal will and divine structure. He appointed priests for every god, vestals for the eternal flame, and augurs who read the flight of birds as if deciphering the breath of destiny. Rome became a clockwork of faith, its hours marked by sacrifice, its days divided by devotion. The citizens found comfort in this predictability, unaware that stillness was shaping them into something enduring. The king himself was both priest and philosopher. He sought counsel not from generals, but from the goddess Egeria, a spirit of the sacred spring said to whisper secrets from the underworld of wisdom. Each dawn, Numa walked alone to her grove, where the trees bowed like listeners. There he learned that power without piety collapses under its own weight. His reign became a dialogue between man and mystery, between clay and cloud. Those who saw him return from the forest spoke of a calm so profound it unsettled them. They did not yet know that peace too is a kind of strength, the kind that endures when swords rust and empires fade. The city changed beneath his touch. Where Romulus had drawn blood, Numa drew boundaries. Where one built walls, the other built meaning. Festivals bloomed through the seasons, the Feriae, the Perilia, the rites of harvest and hearth. The people learned to measure time by the turning of rituals, not battles. Music replaced the clash of steel, and prayers replaced commands. Children grew up knowing the names of gods before those of kings. Yet within that serenity lingered a quiet paradox. Rome, the city of conquest, was being taught restraint. The wolf within was not slain, merely sleeping, its breath slow, waiting. Even the soldiers felt the change, their swords dulled with disuse, but their spirits did not weaken. Numa taught them discipline of a different kind, the patience to stand guard in peace, the courage to protect rather than invade. Training grounds became places of reflection. Shields were polished as symbols of duty, not blood. The city's armories gleamed under the sun like silent prayers. The people believed Rome had found eternal peace, though destiny watched with an amused and distant gaze. For no fire burns forever without fuel, and no empire remains still for long. The gods, ever restless, were already stirring. One evening, as twilight deepened over the hills, Numa stood upon the walls and gazed at the flickering lights of his city. The air was fragrant with smoke from hearths and sacrifices, a mingling of devotion and mortality. He closed his eyes and felt the heartbeat of Rome beneath his feet, steady, strong, content. Yet he knew contentment was the most dangerous illusion of all. Peace had made them pure but not prepared. He whispered a prayer into the wind, asking that Rome remember balance when hunger returned. The wind answered softly, carrying his words through the alleys, through the temples, through time itself. Peace had lingered so long that it began to feel like nature itself, like dawn or rainfall, something eternal. Yet peace is only another form of silence, and silence always hides unrest. The people of Rome grew accustomed to predictability. Their prayers turned to habits, their faith to routine. Temples stood immaculate, but their altars grew cold beneath the weight of repetition. Even the priests, once awed by their rituals, began to recite without wonder. The gods who feed upon attention and awe stirred restlessly in their invisible realms. Thunder rolled across the hills, though no storm followed. Dogs barked at empty air. The augurs saw strange patterns in the sky. Birds flying in circles, clouds shaped like crowns broken in two. Something in the balance had begun to shift. Numa felt it before anyone spoke. His sleep grew troubled, filled with dreams of rivers running backward and fires burning without smoke. In his visions, the goddess Egeria wept beside her spring, whispering that peace had ripened into fragility. He rose before dawn each day, walking the silent streets to the edge of the forest. The dew clung to his robes like memory, heavy and cold. There, he knelt by the sacred grove and asked the unseen whether Rome had offended heaven. The wind answered in fragments, a murmur of leaves, a distant echo of wings. He returned to the city with eyes darker than before, carrying warnings no one wished to hear. The omens grew bolder. A statue of Jupiter cracked down the middle. Lightning struck a temple twice in the same night. Cattle were born with 2 heads, and the Tiber overflowed though no rain had fallen. The people whispered that the gods were displeased, though none could name the sin. Numa ordered days of fasting and purification, but unease only deepened. He gathered the augurs in the forum, their faces pale in torchlight, and demanded truth. They spoke of imbalance, of rituals performed with empty hearts, of prayers uttered without conviction. Rome had kept the form of piety, but lost its soul. Order had become its own corruption. That night, Numa stood upon the steps of the Temple of Vesta, staring at the eternal flame. It flickered, uncertain, as though breathing with fear. Around him, the city slept. Roofs gleaming with moonlight, alleys hushed like the pause before confession. He whispered to the fire, asking whether the gods still watched over men. The flame bent toward him once, then steadied, offering neither comfort nor answer. He understood then that faith was not protection, but a mirror. It reflected whatever mankind brought to it, devotion or decay. Rome's reflection had begun to darken, and though the city still glowed, the glow came from embers, not from light. In the days that followed, Numa's calm became his curse. The people begged for reassurance, but he spoke little, only reminding them to live rightly, to remember the sacredness of measure. They mistook his restraint for weakness, and whispers grew like ivy along the walls. Some said the king's goddess had forsaken him, others that his wisdom had turned to madness. Yet he remained still, as if waiting for the truth to ripen. He knew that peace, stretched too long, becomes brittle. Beneath serenity's mask, ambition begins to stir. The old Roman hunger breathing again, faint but certain. The wolf was waking beneath the marble. One evening, as twilight burned to ash, a storm finally broke. Rain fell in sheets over the temples, washing away the dust of years. The streets ran red with clay, and thunder shook the hills like the voice of forgotten gods. Numa stood beneath the storm's weight, arms outstretched, face raised to the sky. Lightning flashed, and for a moment he looked like a man caught between 2 worlds, mortal in body, divine in endurance. When the storm passed, the air smelled clean but sharp, as though something had been taken. The city slept uneasily that night, aware yet unknowing that the age of stillness had ended. The storm passed, but its echo lingered in the air like a held breath. Rome shimmered under grey skies, its temples glistening with rain, its streets heavy with silence. The eternal flame in Vesta's shrine flickered weakly, as though exhausted by devotion. Numa walked among his people, his robe soaked, his eyes distant. The city greeted him with uneasy reverence. They still loved him, yet their hearts yearned for something fiercer, something that could remind them of fire. The king, sensing this, smiled softly, as one might smile at a dream nearing its end. He had given them order, and in doing so had taken from them their appetite for chaos. Even the gods seemed to turn their gaze elsewhere, restless for thunder again. As days passed, Numa withdrew more often into solitude. He no longer attended councils or festivals. Instead, he wandered the sacred groves beyond the city, where the air smelled of pine and time itself. There he spoke to Egeria, the spirit who had once guided him, though now her voice seemed faint, like wind through reeds. He asked her if peace could truly last in a world made of hunger. The spring answered with ripples but no sound. He understood then that his work was complete, that his kind of rule could not survive the fire it had tamed. His heart grew heavy, not with regret, but with understanding. Even wisdom must yield to the pulse of history. One dawn he summoned the priests and senators to his chamber. The walls glowed with the soft light of early sun, dust floating like quiet prayers. Numa sat upon a simple seat, his crown beside him, untouched. He spoke gently, his voice slow and deliberate, each word a stone laid in farewell. "The city no longer needs my silence," he said. "It needs motion. It needs risk." Those present felt the weight of prophecy in his calm. He blessed them, asking only that they keep balance in times of change. No one dared to answer. They left in silence, their sandals whispering across marble floors that seemed to hum with finality. That evening, he walked once more to the grove of Egeria. The forest was quiet, save for the hum of insects and the distant trickle of water. He knelt beside the spring and looked into its depths, where his reflection wavered between man and memory. "My peace has ended," he whispered, "but may it never die." The wind moved through the branches like a sigh, scattering petals upon the surface. He closed his eyes, and the world seemed to hold him in suspension, neither living nor gone, only returning. When the moon rose, its light touched the grove, and where he had knelt, there was only still water. Word spread through Rome like a slow heartbeat. The people gathered in the forum, torches in hand, their faces solemn beneath the flicker. They did not wail, for Numa had taught them quiet strength. They built a tomb upon the Janiculum hill, overlooking both the river and the city he had tamed. There they laid him, crowned not with gold, but with olive leaves. The air smelled of smoke and rain, of endings and blessings intertwined. Priests murmured prayers until their voices cracked into silence. And as the sun sank behind the hills, the city seemed to pause, listening, perhaps, for the last echo of its peace. Night fell softly upon Rome. The eternal flame burned steady once more, as if honoring the man who had taught it patience. Yet in the shadows, something unseen began to stir. Soldiers sharpened blades again. Merchants spoke of trade beyond the mountains. Senators debated conquest in low voices. The calm that had held Rome for decades was unraveling thread by thread. Above, the moon drifted behind clouds, veiling its light like a secret. The gods, sated with silence, turned again toward the noise of men. The age of peace had ended, and in the distance, destiny began to walk once more. After Numa's passing, Rome stood at a crossroads between reverence and restlessness. The people had known peace too long. Their hands, once trained to till and build, itched for the weight of the sword. Temples still smoked with offerings, but the air had changed, sharper, hungrier. From the ashes of order rose ambition, unspoken yet felt in every marketplace and forum. The elders gathered beneath the open sky, robes shifting in the breeze like pale banners of thought. There was no longer a single king to obey. The crown had become a question. So they created a council, men chosen not for lineage but for influence, not for holiness but for voice. Thus the Senate was born, and with it, the first breath of the Republic. The Senate met beneath the Capitoline's shadow, where the stones still remembered Romulus's oath. The air carried both history and hesitation, as though the gods themselves leaned in to listen. There were no thrones, only benches, a circle of equals who would learn that equality was its own form of struggle. They spoke of justice, of freedom, of keeping Rome from the hunger of kings. Yet beneath their solemn words moved quieter intentions, pride, envy, the longing to be remembered. The Republic began not as purity, but as compromise. It was born from fear of tyranny and the hope that men could govern themselves without falling to chaos. Hope, in Rome, was never gentle. It was carved from suspicion. In those first days, the city breathed with cautious optimism. The senators moved through the streets like priests of a new faith, their gestures deliberate, their voices firm. They wrote laws to tame the will of men, weaving reason where instinct once ruled. The people cheered the end of monarchy, yet in their cheers lingered uncertainty. Who now held the favor of the gods? Whose command could unite an army or calm a mob? The Senate offered no single figure to worship, only an idea. That power itself should be shared, restrained, balanced like a blade between hands. The Republic was a living experiment in control, and every heartbeat of the city tested its endurance. The first years were uneasy. Rivals rose like shadows against the wall of unity. Factions formed in the Senate, patricians guarding old privilege, plebeians demanding voice. The streets filled with debate that smelled of sweat and incense. Each dawn brought new decrees, each dusk new disputes. Yet Rome endured, not through agreement, but through tension. The people learned that freedom was not silence, but the noise of argument, the chorus of a city finding its rhythm. The gods, perhaps amused, watched their creation grow restless again. The divine order of Numa replaced by the beautiful disorder of men. Still, even in chaos, Rome thrived. Trade expanded. The fields of Latium shimmered with grain beneath the sun. Soldiers drilled in the plains beyond the walls, their shields flashing like scales of a waking dragon. The Senate grew confident, sending envoys to neighboring cities, promising alliance yet preparing for war. They claimed it was for defense, for honor, for Rome's destiny. But beneath every oath was the whisper of ambition. For power, once divided, always seeks reunion. And though no one dared speak it aloud, the shadow of kingship lingered, thin as smoke, in every council hall. At night, when torches burned low and the streets emptied, the Senate's chambers echoed with the murmurs of unseen futures. The marble floor, worn smooth by sandals and secrets, held the weight of coming centuries. A single oil lamp burned before the statue of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, its flame steady, its light trembling. Outside, the city slept, a restless sleep filled with the dreams of destiny. For Rome had traded one heartbeat for another. The crown had shattered into 100 minds, and each believed itself chosen. The Republic was alive, and though it did not yet know it, it had already begun to suffocate beneath its own breath. The Republic was young, and youth rarely understands restraint. Power, newly freed from kings, moved through Rome like fire-tasting air for the first time. The Senate, proud of its creation, spoke of equality, but the city's pulse still beat to the rhythm of rivalry. Each man believed himself a guardian of liberty, yet each sought a crown made of influence. In the markets, whispers grew like ivy, of secret pacts, of debts forgiven for favors promised. Freedom, so new and fragile, began to tremble under the weight of greed. The Forum, once filled with songs of unity, now echoed with arguments that turned into accusations. And beneath it all, the gods watched silently, remembering how men always turned devotion into division. Among those early senators rose two families whose names would etch themselves into the Republic's memory, the Fabii and the Claudii. The Fabii, born of soldiers and farmers, spoke of duty and justice. The Claudii, of noble descent, whispered of hierarchy and order. Between them stretched a tension too vast for laws to contain. Their debates filled the Senate with words sharpened into weapons. The people listened, torn between admiration and exhaustion. It was said that when the Fabii spoke, the crowd nodded. When the Claudii answered, they shivered. The Republic had found its first true battleground, not fields of blood but chambers of thought. The conflict soon spilled into the streets. Mobs gathered, shouting the names of their chosen houses. Stones replaced arguments, dust replaced reason. The city that once prided itself on law became a theater of unrest. Statues were defaced, temples defiled in anger disguised as patriotism. The Senate convened again, its air heavy with smoke from the riots below. The senators spoke of restoring order, yet none dared surrender pride for peace. Numa's laws still hung in the archives like fading ghosts, unread, untouched, irrelevant. What Rome had gained in freedom, it was losing in unity. Every heartbeat of the Republic sounded more like a drumbeat of war. In the midst of this chaos stood two brothers, Titus and Marcus Fabius, heirs of their family's ideals. Titus, the elder, believed in compromise, Marcus in defiance. They had been raised together beneath the same gods, their childhood filled with dreams of Rome's glory. But the Senate's corruption burned Marcus from within. He accused his brother of weakness, calling peace a coward's luxury. Titus, weary, replied that the Republic must learn mercy before mastery. The words that passed between them that night would echo for generations. Bloodlines became battlegrounds, and in Rome, betrayal always began at the dinner table. Soon after, Marcus led a faction into the streets, calling for reform by force. He demanded purges, executions, cleansing of the Senate's rot. The people followed him, not for justice, but for spectacle. Rome had learned to love fire again. Titus, torn between duty and blood, tried to reason with him at the steps of the Forum. Their words, once the language of brothers, turned to shouts that split the air. A dagger flashed in torchlight. No one saw who struck first. When silence fell, Marcus lay dead, his brother kneeling beside him, his hands trembling with crimson that would never wash away. The crowd scattered like birds startled by thunder. Titus remained, frozen beneath the statues of gods who had seen this cycle too many times before. He did not flee. He only whispered a prayer, not for forgiveness, but for forgetfulness. The Senate declared him guilty, for Rome could not afford to pity those who killed in passion. He was led through the streets in chains, past the same walls he had sworn to protect. The people watched, silent, their faces pale beneath the flicker of torchlight. They saw in him their own reflection. Faith turned to fire, and law to sorrow. That night, as the city slept uneasily, the Tiber carried the moonlight like spilled silver. Somewhere along its banks, an old priest whispered that Rome had been baptized again, not in water but in blood. The Senate, shaken yet unrepentant, resumed its debates at dawn, as if death were simply another motion passed by majority. The Republic endured, but something within it had changed forever. Freedom had tasted sacrifice, and it would not forget the flavor. From that day, power wore mourning as easily as a crown. The brothers were gone, but their shadow lingered in every oath and every lie that followed. Rome's streets still smelled of blood when the Senate turned its eyes outward. The grief of civil strife needed distraction, and conquest was the oldest cure for guilt. Beyond the city's walls lay fertile lands, rival cities, and endless opportunity. The senators spoke of destiny, but what they truly sought was forgetfulness. Legions were raised, armor polished, banners dyed in crimson. The clang of forges replaced the chants of priests. Smiths worked through the night, their hammers striking rhythm like heartbeat against anvil. The city that once whispered prayers now echoed with the promise of war. For Rome, violence was not madness. It was memory returning. The wolf stirred again, and this time she wore bronze. The first campaigns were against the tribes of Latium, neighbors turned enemies by ambition. Fields that had shared harvests became battlegrounds soaked with rain and blood. The legions marched in silence, their sandals pressing history into the earth. The men fought not for gods or gold, but for belonging. Every spear thrown was an argument for Rome's survival. Every shield raised a denial of weakness. When victory came, it came without celebration, only exhaustion and pride woven together. Captured banners hung in the forum, fluttering like sighs of the conquered. The Senate declared triumph, yet beneath the cheers lay unease. The Republic had learned that power could unify where law could not. With each conquest, Rome's lungs filled wider. The roads stretched farther, the boundaries blurred. The Senate grew rich from spoils, its marble floors gleaming like calm seas hiding storms below. Soldiers returned as heroes, bearing scars as proof of devotion. The people greeted them with flowers and songs, yet behind the songs were questions. Who truly commanded Rome now? The orators in the Senate or the men who bled in its name? Power was dividing again, quietly, invisibly. The Republic's fire burned brighter, but it began to consume its own foundations, for no flame, however noble, can grow without devouring something sacred. In time, Rome's legions reached the mountains of Etruria and the coasts of Campania. They fought not only for territory but for ideology, to prove that their system, their republic, was chosen by the gods. The enemy's cities were razed, their people enslaved, their temples rededicated to Roman divinities. The Senate called it order, the poets called it destiny. But among the ashes, the old gods whispered that this was merely another form of monarchy, one spread across miles instead of minds. Rome did not yet see it, but in conquering others, it was beginning to conquer itself. War reshaped everything it touched. The soldiers brought back not only gold and captives, but ideas, new gods, new customs, new doubts. The city became a mosaic of cultures, a breathing labyrinth of belief and ambition. The forum smelled of spice and sweat. Voices of foreign tongues mingled with Latin hymns. Rome's greatness began to grow from its contradictions, unity through difference, strength through absorption. Yet even as it expanded, something fragile began to crack beneath. Too many victories make a people forget their limits, and Rome, drunk on its own legend, began to forget it was mortal. One night, as torches burned low along the Tiber, a senator stood alone by the water. His armor reflected the moonlight like liquid fire. He watched the river move, steady and indifferent, carrying fragments of the past, leaves, ash, petals from forgotten festivals. He whispered to it, "How long can men rule the world before the world remembers itself?" The river gave no answer. It did not need to. Its current carried the truth quietly, that empires are only reflections of their hunger. Rome's reflection now burned too bright to last. The Republic had become flame, and flames, no matter how divine, always consume their source. The more Rome conquered, the less it remembered the stillness of its beginnings. Victory had become rhythm, and rhythm had become need. The Senate, once the guardian of principle, now served the machinery of ambition. Its marble halls rang with speeches about virtue, while hands beneath the table counted coins of conquest. The laws they wrote were meant to restrain men, but instead they armored greed with legitimacy. Decrees multiplied like vines, entangling justice until no one could see where morality ended and advantage began. The Republic was no longer a promise, it was a habit, a ritual of control performed for the illusion of freedom. And through this illusion, Rome marched forward, unblinking, unrepentant, magnificent. In the fields beyond the city, the legions trained as if the gods themselves demanded precision. Every step, every motion was ritual. The clang of iron was their prayer, the rhythm of marching their hymn. The soldiers became extensions of the Republic's will, disciplined, tireless, merciless. They believed themselves free, yet their freedom lay in obedience. Each shield was polished to reflect not the sky, but authority. When they moved, the earth seemed to tremble with calculation, not passion. In their unity, Rome found its immortality. In their silence, it sowed its downfall. For no system can remain human once it learns to replace thought with command. From the order of armies came the order of law. Rome built courts as it built fortresses, with precision, with permanence, with fear. The 12 tables were carved not to inspire virtue, but to protect it from erosion. Justice became something visible, tangible, measurable. Citizens stood before the law as soldiers before a general, obedient, cautious, reverent. It was said that under these laws even kings would have bowed, had any dared to remain. Yet every law that bound one man gave another permission to rule. The Republic was learning the art of subtle monarchy, rule without a crown, control without confession. In the Senate, men argued over definitions, liberty, honor, duty, as if words themselves could hold back the tide of empire. Outside, the people cheered the generals who brought home triumphs instead of speeches. Statues rose faster than temples. The scent of olive oil and blood mingled in the streets. Markets overflowed with spoils, gold from Carthage, silk from the east, slaves from lands too far to name. The Republic grew rich, but its heart grew hollow. Freedom had become spectacle, virtue performance. The Senate's marble shone, but beneath it lay the same red dust that had buried kings. Rome was not decaying, it was hardening. The generals began to eclipse the senators in both glory and loyalty. Armies pledged themselves not to the Republic, but to the men who led them. Authority, once spoken through debate, was now carried in the cadence of marching feet. The line between law and war blurred, as though the gods had melted them into one. Victory became the Republic's morality. So long as Rome expanded, it believed itself righteous. And so, conquest turned from duty to addiction. Each new province fed the hunger for more, and in this endless appetite, the Republic found both its vitality and its curse. At dusk, the city glowed beneath the bronze light of its own ambition. Senators returned home through streets where slaves carried torches, and the air smelled of iron and incense. On the hills, soldiers drilled beneath fading suns, their shadows long and identical. The Tiber flowed quietly, untroubled, carrying reflections of temples and triumphal arches. From its depths one might have seen both beauty and burden intertwined. For Rome had bound itself, not to gods, not to kings, but to its own creation. Its strength was no longer a choice, but a law written in muscle and stone. The Republic did not breathe anymore, it commanded. The Republic stood at the height of its confidence, its banners bright against the horizon, its heart steady with pride. The Senate spoke of destiny as though it were a birthright, and the soldiers believed it. The legions had tamed the hills of Italy and now looked toward the sea, where another power waited, Carthage, mistress of trade, queen of sails. Between them stretched an ocean of envy. Rome's land-born discipline faced Carthage's mercantile cunning, and the Mediterranean became a mirror for ambition. The air was heavy with prophecy. In the harbors, the smell of tar, salt, and metal filled the dawn. The gods, sensing drama, turned their eyes once more toward men. When the First Punic War began, Rome was unready for the sea. Her men were farmers and engineers, not sailors. Yet necessity breeds invention faster than faith breeds miracles. They built ships in weeks, copying a single captured Carthaginian vessel, plank by plank. The new navy launched like an imitation of destiny, crude, earnest, unstoppable. At Mylae, their clumsy fleets met the seasoned armadas of Carthage. The sea churned with iron and foam, with screams swallowed by wind. Rome's genius was not mastery but adaptation. She chained land to water with her invention, the corvus, a boarding bridge that turned sea battles into hand-to-hand wars. Victory came not from elegance but from stubbornness. The wolf had learned to swim. Years stretched into decades of ruin. Battles were won and lost like breaths between storms. Sicily burned, Sardinia bled, and the sea grew red with trade routes turned graveyards. Yet every defeat taught Rome another rhythm. The Republic learned patience from loss, courage from starvation, and empire from endurance. The Senate, though weary, refused surrender, declaring that the gods favored persistence above brilliance. And so, when the final victory came, it came not with glory, but exhaustion. The city celebrated beneath a pale sun, its joy tempered by the weight of what it had endured. For the first time, Rome understood that conquest was both crown and chain, but peace never lingered where pride breathed. Beyond the Alps, a child named Hannibal studied Rome with quiet fury. He swore an oath before his father as gods that he would destroy her or die in her shadow. Years later, his elephants crossed the mountains like phantoms of vengeance. Snow fell upon armor, and thunder rolled through the frozen peaks. Rome trembled, but she did not fall. Her fields burned, her legions broke, yet her will remained unbroken. The Republic bled but did not bow. In every loss she rediscovered herself, not as victim but as inevitable. Hannibal's victories carved fear into Rome's bones, yet they also forged the steel of her destiny. The Second Punic War became more than a contest of nations. It was a dialogue between two wills that refused silence. Hannibal was cunning, merciful, terrible, a storm that admired its own beauty. Rome was relentless, methodical, patient, a mountain learning to move. For 16 years, Italy became a wound that would not heal. The countryside turned to ash, the temples to whispers. But beneath ruin, a new strength hardened. When Scipio finally carried war back across the sea to Carthage, it was not revenge but completion. At Zama, the dust rose so thick it hid the horizon, and history itself seemed to hold its breath. Hannibal fell, and with him, the last mirror that Rome might have feared to face. When the war ended, Rome stood victorious, yet hollowed. The Senate's steps were worn smooth by triumphal processions, and the people's cheers grew faint with repetition. Ships returned loaded with spoils, gold, grain, and sorrow. The Republic had devoured its rival, but something in its hunger had changed. Conquest no longer felt like defense. It had become destiny's demand. The wolf, once feral and faithful to survival, now prowled with arrogance. She no longer hunted for food, but for validation. And as Rome looked across the seas toward Greece, Egypt, and Asia, she mistook expansion for immortality. The wars that built her world had begun to unbuild her soul. Victory did not come as salvation. It came as temptation. Rome had swallowed Carthage and spat out its bones, yet the taste of power lingered like honey turned to poison. Gold flooded the city from conquered lands. Marble replaced mud, and mansions rose where once had been farms. The senators, once simple men of labor, now dressed in silk from the east and perfumed their halls with foreign incense. Slaves outnumbered citizens, working the same fields that had once built the Republic's virtue. The people began to forget the rhythm of sweat and soil. Rome, once a nation of soldiers and builders, was becoming a city of spectators. And though its fires still burned, Their light came not from faith, but vanity. The Senate, heavy with wealth, began to lose its pulse. Debates turned from survival to indulgence, from how to endure to how to enjoy. Senators argued over banquets, not battles, over statues, not soldiers. The public games grew grander, louder, crueler. Gladiators became the new language of control, their blood the ink that wrote Rome's illusion of unity. The poor cheered as they starved, mistaking spectacle for strength. In the shadow of luxury, decay found comfort. The Republic still called itself free, yet freedom had become performance, a ritual repeated to soothe the restless. Beneath the marble floors, the wolf's bones shifted, uneasy, aware that something ancient was dying quietly beneath the applause. Meanwhile, the provinces groaned beneath the weight of empire. Governors appointed by Rome turned their territories into kingdoms of greed. Taxes grew heavier, promises thinner. The people of conquered lands learned to bow in daylight and curse in darkness. Yet even their resentment fed the city. Grain from Egypt, silver from Spain, slaves from Greece. The Tiber carried ships heavy with tribute, the river's surface glimmering with gold dust. But beneath the shimmer, rot was spreading. The Republic had mistaken wealth for stability, mistaking stillness for peace. The same iron discipline that had conquered the world was now melting in the warmth of excess. There were voices who saw the danger, Stoics, dreamers, and reformers who spoke of returning to Rome's old virtues. Among them rose Tiberius Gracchus, whose name would echo through centuries. He looked upon the endless estates of the rich and the hollow eyes of the poor and called it injustice. His words fell like sparks on dry fields. The Senate heard rebellion in every truth he spoke. They smiled in public and conspired in private. When he stood before the people, demanding the land be shared once more, daggers answered instead of reason. The forum filled with shouting, then silence. His body was left broken beside the statues of gods who had long since looked away. Rome mourned him in whispers. For the first time since the kings, blood had been spilled within the sacred walls of the city, not by enemies, but by citizens. The Senate called it justice, the people called it murder. And though the streets returned to calm, something irreversible had cracked. Tiberius's death became a wound that never closed. His brother Gaius rose after him, burning with purpose, and met the same fate. The Republic had learned that the easiest way to silence truth was through ceremony. Call it order, wrap it in law, and bury it beneath applause. From then on, every reformer carried not a banner, but a death sentence. The years that followed were years of golden decay. Art, architecture, and rhetoric flourished, like flowers blooming from a grave. Rome's streets dazzled with triumphal arches and marble statues of men who had long forgotten humility. Philosophers preached moderation in gardens built with the spoils of war. The Senate grew old and proud, its members feeding the illusion of stability, while chaos brewed beneath the surface. The Republic had never looked so magnificent, and yet, in its perfection, it had never been more hollow. The gods had given Rome everything, and wealth, beauty, dominion, only to see what she would do with it. And Rome, in her glory, began to forget that gods envy nothing more than permanence. In the centuries that followed the fall of Carthage, Rome stood as the master of all horizons, yet mastery had made her fragile. Power had spread too far, like light stretched thin across endless seas. The Republic was no longer a city, but a world, and in that world unity began to crack. Armies fought wars in foreign lands, but their loyalties drifted toward the generals who led them. Men like Marius, Sulla, and Pompey rose from obscurity to command legions that obeyed one voice alone, their own. The Senate, proud but hollow, watched as authority slipped quietly from marble to metal. For in the age of conquest, the sword had learned to speak louder than law. Rome, which once feared kings, now birthed men who ruled as if they were gods without crowns. Gaius Marius was the first to bend Rome's fate toward the soldier's will. A man of humble birth, he promised reform, opportunity, and vengeance against corruption. His words caught like fire among the poor. He opened the legions to those who owned no land, giving them bread, armor, and belonging. But what he truly gave them was allegiance, not to the Republic, but to him. The soldiers followed him with reverence once reserved for gods. Victories came swiftly, each one feeding the illusion of control. Yet every triumph whispered the same quiet warning. A republic that pays its army with loyalty will one day pay for it in blood. When Marius's power began to wane, another man stepped forward from the same smoke, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Cold, methodical, and merciless, he saw in Rome not a home but a disease. He called himself surgeon, yet his blade was no tool of healing. Marching his army upon the city itself, he broke the unspoken law that no general should cross the sacred boundary with weapons. The people watched in horror as soldiers flooded the streets where once only processions had marched. The Senate bowed, the temples burned, and the Republic trembled under the weight of its own creation. Rome had become both patient and wound. Sulla ruled through terror wrapped in legality. His purges cleansed the city of enemies and filled its coffers with confiscated estates. Names were carved into wooden tablets, lists of death sanctioned by order, murder disguised as reform. Each morning, citizens walked the streets reading who would not live to see another dusk. The marble of the Forum absorbed more blood than rain. Yet amid the fear, Rome learned something dangerous, that order could exist without justice, that control could masquerade as virtue. When Sulla finally resigned his dictatorship and retired to his villa by the sea, the city did not breathe relief. It gasped in disbelief that power could ever be surrendered voluntarily. But the peace he left behind was a hollow echo. Ambition, once unleashed, could not be chained again. Marius's followers plotted revenge. Sulla's allies sharpened daggers in defense. Civil war became the Republic's new dialect. Brothers marched against brothers, banners torn and re-sewn in shifting loyalties. Cities that had once cheered for victory now burned beneath their own symbols. The fields of Italy turned crimson beneath legions who once fought side by side. The wolf that had suckled founders now devoured her own children. The gods, it was said, no longer answered prayers, their temples filled with dust, their altars cold. Rome prayed now only to herself. Out of this chaos rose figures whose names would one day define destiny. Pompey the Great, Crassus the Rich, and a young patrician of calm ambition named Julius Caesar. They watched the Republic falter and saw opportunity in its wounds. Together they forged a fragile alliance, a trinity of pride bound by necessity. The people loved them, the Senate feared them, and the legions obeyed. It was power balanced on a sword's edge, an experiment in shared rule that the world had never seen. Yet even in its creation lay its undoing, for nothing built from hunger ever lasts. 3 suns cannot share one sky. In the taverns and markets, people spoke of destiny as if it were entertainment. They whispered that Rome had outgrown her own laws, that a single mind might better steer her vastness than 100 arguing tongues. The idea of the Republic, once sacred, once holy, began to sound old-fashioned, almost naive. The citizens, tired of chaos, began to crave control. And thus, the seed planted by Marius, watered by Sulla, and tended by ambition began to bloom. Freedom, once Rome's pride, was slowly being traded for order. The empire to be had already begun to breathe within the dying lungs of its mother. The air of Rome grew heavy with expectation. The Republic stood like an aging monument, noble in outline, cracked in foundation. Within the Senate's marble walls, debate had become theater, conviction performance. Outside, the people turned their eyes toward one man who seemed carved from certainty itself, Julius Caesar. His words were calm, his gaze unflinching, his ambition quiet but absolute. He spoke of reform, of debt, of fairness, yet behind every promise breathed the shape of empire. He was the child of all Rome's contradictions, soldier and scholar, populist and tyrant, visionary and doom. The people loved him because he gave their chaos meaning. The Senate feared him because he reminded them how little their words could command the wind. Caesar's rise was as swift as it was inevitable. As consul, he charmed the masses. As general, he conquered Gaul. His legions followed him across frozen rivers and burning plains, his banners crowned with victories that glimmered like constellations. From the mountains of Helvetia to the shores of Britannia, he carried Rome farther than any before him. Yet the farther he marched, the more he became the Republic itself, its hunger, its brilliance, its cruelty. The Senate, watching from afar, trembled. They praised his triumphs in public and plotted his ruin in private. They did not yet understand that Caesar no longer needed their approval. He had found a different audience: the army, the people, and history itself. When the Senate demanded his disbandment, Caesar stood at the banks of the Rubicon, staring into the dark water. The night was cold and silent, save for the rustle of standards in the wind. Behind him, his men waited, loyal, sleepless, ready. He knew that one step would shatter centuries of law, yet hesitation was foreign to him. "The die is cast," he murmured, and crossed the river. It was not merely a march toward Rome, it was a march into immortality. The city woke to the sound of its own heart breaking. Legions filled the streets, senators fled their chambers. The Republic, once the proud creation of many, knelt before the will of one. Civil war followed like thunder after lightning. Rome turned upon itself, as if purging the memory of its ideals. Caesar pursued Pompey across the Mediterranean, brother against brother, teacher against student. Battles blurred into seasons. The world became Rome's battlefield. At Pharsalus, dust rose like smoke from a burning age. Pompey fled, and the Republic fled with him. When news came of his death in Egypt, Caesar wept, not for loss, but for the futility of rivals. He had no equal left to fight, only the ghost of the Republic that lingered in the Senate's hollow speeches. Power had ceased to be shared. It had found its shape at last. Singular, inevitable, divine. When Caesar returned to Rome, the people greeted him not as a man, but as myth. They lined the streets, tossing flowers before his chariot, shouting his name as though it were prayer. He wore no crown, yet every gesture of the crowd placed one upon his brow. The Senate, trapped between reverence and resentment, named him dictator for life. In their fear, they had given him what they feared most. He reformed the calendar, rebuilt cities, forgave enemies, all with the calm of a man arranging his own legend. The people saw benevolence, his peers saw warning. He spoke of Rome's eternity, yet the echo of the word king hung like smoke above the forum. On the 15th day of March, the morning smelled of rain and prophecy. Caesar walked toward the Senate chamber, his robe bright against the gray light. The streets were hushed as though the city itself held its breath. Within the chamber waited men he called friends, Brutus, Cassius, and others, whose loyalty had curdled into fear. As he entered, whispers died. A circle closed around him, soft as ceremony. The first blade struck beneath the ribs, the next followed like ritual. He did not cry out. Only when he saw Brutus did he exhale, not words, only recognition. Then he fell, and the world shifted. The Republic died with him, though it would take centuries for Rome to admit it. For days the city burned with grief and confusion. The Senate hid, the mob howled, the gods remained silent. Caesar's body lay upon the pyre, his face pale beneath the glow of his own creation. When the flames rose, the people threw torches into the fire until it became a sun reborn within the forum. They wept and screamed, not knowing whether they mourned a man or themselves. The ashes rose into the wind and drifted across the rooftops, falling upon temples, statues, and soldiers alike. Thus, Rome crowned its first emperor without ceremony. The Republic was gone, replaced by an echo wearing laurels. Power had found its final form, not in law, not in virtue, but in inevitability. The fire that consumed Caesar's body left behind more than ashes. It left faith. Rome awoke beneath a strange new dawn, the sky tinted with the color of empire. The people spoke his name not as memory, but as invocation. They claimed to see his spirit in comets, in storms, in the trembling of the Tiber. The Republic, though still spoken of, had become a ghost wandering its own ruins. In the silence that followed his death, the city searched for meaning in smoke. Statues of the fallen general were draped in flowers. Whispers filled the air like incense. Men and women alike began to call him Divus Julius, Julius the Divine. Power had not died with him. It had only changed shape, shedding its mortal skin. From the ashes rose a young heir, Gaius Octavius, Caesar's adopted son. Barely 20, pale and deliberate, he carried himself with the calm of one who listens before he moves. To the weary people he seemed harmless, to the Senate manageable. Yet beneath his quiet demeanor slept a will as cold and precise as marble. He spoke little but observed everything. His words were measured, his patience endless. In the chaos that followed Caesar's death, others rushed to fill the vacuum. Mark Antony, bold and eloquent; Lepidus, powerful but pliant. Octavian waited. He knew empires are not seized. They are inherited through silence and inevitability. And so he watched as Rome tore itself apart again, knowing that each act of violence made his calm more divine. Antony, Caesar's ally turned orator, believed himself the rightful successor. His voice ruled the streets. His speeches ignited crowds. He promised vengeance against the assassins, justice for Caesar, and glory for Rome. The people followed him with torches in hand. Their grief turned into fury. But Octavian understood something deeper, that mobs burn fast and fade, while institutions remember. He turned to the Senate, not to fight it, but to tame it. His charm was weapon, his youth disguise. While Antony raged, Octavian smiled. While the streets bled, he counted loyalties in whispers. Rome's new god had no thunder. He moved like water, wearing down stone. The war against Caesar's killers became Rome's new religion. Brutus and Cassius fled east, raising armies in the name of freedom, but their cause already sounded like nostalgia. The people no longer remembered liberty. They remembered order. In the plains of Philippi, the armies met, Rome against itself once more. Dust swallowed the sun as shields clashed and eagles screamed overhead. When the battle ended, both assassins lay dead, their ideals buried with them. Octavian and Antony stood victorious together, two suns sharing one sky. They divided the empire, Antony taking the east, Octavian the west. But like all twin stars, their brightness foretold collision. Antony found solace in Egypt, beneath the gaze of Cleopatra, queen, scholar, goddess of her own making. Together they built dreams of a new empire, one born not in Rome's shadow but in the warmth of the Nile. Their love became legend, their alliance threat. In the temples of Alexandria, gold glittered brighter than restraint. Yet even as they reigned in splendor, the Roman heart grew uneasy. The Senate whispered of betrayal, of Eastern decadence, of a Roman general lost to a foreign queen. Octavian listened and said nothing. He understood the power of stories, that empires are not destroyed by armies but by narrative. He began to write his own. Through careful words and forged letters, Octavian transformed Antony into an enemy of the people. He spoke not of jealousy but of duty. Rome, he said, must be saved from a man who would place Egypt above the Republic. The people believed him, as they always believed whoever spoke last. War returned as it always did, not for land, not for freedom, but for the right to define truth. At Actium, the sea turned black with smoke and splintered ships. The wind carried the smell of salt and destiny. When dawn came, Antony's fleet was gone, Cleopatra's dreams extinguished, and Octavian stood unchallenged. The Republic's corpse had finally found its heir. He returned to Rome not as conqueror but as healer. The city, weary from decades of blood, greeted him with quiet awe. He did not call himself king nor emperor. Such titles had ruined others. Instead, he named himself princeps, the first among equals, as though humility could hide the crown. The Senate bowed, the people knelt, and even the gods seemed to grant him permission. Temples were raised, reforms announced, and peace declared. But it was not the peace of still water. It was the peace of stillness after a storm, the silence that follows surrender. Rome exhaled, unaware it had just taken its first breath as an empire. Rome glowed beneath the rule of Octavian, now Augustus, its marble white against the endless blue of the Mediterranean sky. After centuries of blood and ambition, the city exhaled. The gates of Janus, god of war, were closed for the first time in living memory. Bells rang softly in temples, markets hummed with calm. But beneath the quiet, something subtle had shifted. Freedom had turned to formality, choice to ceremony. Augustus ruled gently, like a shadow stretching across noon. He did not seize power, he embodied it. His peace was not absence of war, but the perfection of control. The citizens called it Pax Romana, the Roman peace, unaware that peace itself had become another weapon. Augustus rebuilt the city as though he were remaking time. Crumbling temples were restored, roads stretched like veins toward the horizon, and aqueducts sang with flowing water. He adorned Rome with marble, claiming to have found it brick and left it stone. Statues of gods, heroes, and ancestors filled the forums until the city resembled a gallery of eternity. Yet every stone bore his signature, every arch his silent approval. He turned architecture into ideology, monument into memory. Rome became a mirror of his mind, orderly, symmetrical, immortal. The citizens, dazzled by beauty, forgot that walls can also imprison. In marble's gleam, obedience looked divine. The Senate still met, still spoke, still voted. But its voice had become theater, a performance to honor the illusion of equality. Augustus sat among them humbly, the first among equals, yet every motion passed was his. Senators addressed him as leader, citizens as father, poets as god. He smiled at all and believed none. His genius lay not in command but in suggestion. He allowed men to believe they served themselves. Those who opposed him vanished not in chains, but in obscurity. Silence became Rome's new law. And in that silence, the empire found rhythm, efficient, polished, eerily calm. The common people adored him. To them, he was not ruler but reassurance. Grain flowed from the provinces, games filled the amphitheaters, and gold shimmered through the streets. Each day felt predictable, safe, anesthetized. The legions guarded the borders, the Senate guarded the illusion, and the people guarded their comfort. No one asked what freedom had cost, because the price had been paid in noise, and noise had been banished. The wolf that once prowled the city's heart now slept beneath silk, dreaming of glory it no longer remembered. The Republic's restlessness had been buried beneath prosperity's gentle weight. Beyond the Tiber, poets sang of this peace as if it were divine. Virgil wrote of destiny fulfilled, Horace of duty sweetened by leisure. Their verses gilded Augustus's rule with eternity. But poetry, like empire, thrives on illusion. The same pen that praised order also trembled with awareness of its fragility. The writers of the Golden Age served their emperor as priests once served the gods, offering beauty in exchange for silence. They did not lie. They refined truth until it gleamed. Thus the empire learned its most dangerous skill, to make obedience feel like art. Even the soldiers, restless in peace, found purpose in maintenance. They built roads instead of battlefields, forts instead of tombs. Along the borders they stood like statues of vigilance, waiting for wars that would never truly end. The veterans returned home laden with honor and gifts, yet uneasy. They had conquered the world only to find no war worth fighting. The empire was safe, but its spirit was still sharpened for conflict. Peace, they discovered, was not rest. It was restraint. And in that restraint, Rome's next fire began to smolder. At twilight, Augustus often walked alone through the Palatine gardens. The marble glowed gold in the dying sun, and cicadas sang between the olive trees. He watched the city beneath him, vast, luminous, orderly, and smiled with quiet fatigue. The gods had granted him everything he desired: stability, reverence, permanence. Yet within him lingered the faint ache of creation finished. For what does a builder become once his work no longer grows? The city below glittered like a jewel too perfect to touch, and perfection, he knew, was only the first shadow of decline. In the years that followed, Augustus grew older, but the empire only seemed younger, gleaming, confident, serene. The city breathed under his laws like a body at rest, its heartbeat steady and predictable. Yet beneath the calm unease began to whisper. No man, not even a god crowned in marble, could escape the gravity of mortality. The statues that bore his likeness multiplied across provinces, each one preserving a moment he could no longer control. He had built eternity from policy, yet he felt time thinning around him like worn silk. The people called him father, the poets divine, but in his solitude he heard neither, only the quiet ticking of his own fading. Rome, once his child, had grown into something vast enough to forget him. He began to see shadows where once he saw harmony. The Senate, obedient but empty, murmured flatteries that no longer satisfied. His own household turned to intrigue. Livia, his wife, patient and deliberate. His stepson Tiberius, watchful and unreadable. Augustus wanted a legacy, not merely heirs, but each successor he touched seemed to wither in ambition or die by fate. The line between inheritance and curse blurred. He had created order so perfect that it suffocated those who sought to lead within it. The empire's peace had become so absolute that it starved greatness itself. And yet the people still smiled, unaware that their golden age was lit by a setting sun. One night, as rain fell softly on the Palatine, Augustus summoned his astrologers and philosophers. They spoke of omens, a comet fading, a storm approaching, a tremor beneath the earth. The emperor listened in silence, his face calm as polished stone. "The gods are restless," one whispered. "No," Augustus replied. "It is only time remembering itself." He dismissed them with a gesture, walked to his balcony and watched lightning flicker over the hills. The rain hissed against the marble, blurring the city lights below. For the first time in decades, Rome looked fragile to him, not from rebellion or hunger, but from the weight of its own perfection. In the years of his decline, the empire began to worship more than govern. Temples multiplied faster than schools, and prayers replaced principles. Augustus had turned divinity into administration, but now divinity was returning to myth. Festivals in his honor grew wilder, his statues draped in flowers, his name sung in hymns. He had become what he feared most, an idea beyond reason. The people adored the image of him more than the man himself. In that adoration he saw his own disappearance. For immortality, he realized, is not eternal life. It is eternal misunderstanding. The Senate, sensing his frailty, began to anticipate succession. Power, once centralized in awe, now scattered into whispers. Tiberius lingered like a shadow in waiting, his loyalty as quiet as his resentment. Livia, veiled and constant, maneuvered like a moon guiding tides unseen. Augustus watched them both with weary affection, knowing the empire he had crafted would endure, but not the peace that bore it. His reign had been an experiment in harmony, yet even harmony becomes noise when repeated too long. The gods demand tension, movement, struggle, and Rome was ready to breathe again, even if that breath came through chaos. In his final years, Augustus withdrew to his villa at Nola, surrounded by statues that mirrored his youth. The air smelled of olives and rain. The gardens glistened with morning dew. He spoke little, preferring to walk among memories. Servants often found him tracing the lines of old maps, as if searching for the borders of his own legacy. On the morning of his death, he asked for a mirror and studied his reflection, not with vanity, but recognition. "Have I played my part well?" he murmured. "Then applaud me." It was the curtain call of an empire's architect, a farewell disguised as theater. When word of his passing reached Rome, the city fell into solemn reverence. The Senate declared him divine. The people mourned as though eternity had paused. His body was carried through the streets lined with marble he had raised, the sound of drums echoing like distant thunder. At the mausoleum on the Tiber's edge, torches shimmered upon his alabaster visage. Livia walked behind the bier in silence, her eyes unreadable beneath the veil. The crowd wept, not from sorrow but from awe, for in his death Augustus had accomplished what life never could. He had become the myth he had once tried to control. That night, the stars over Rome burned brighter than memory. Some said a new one appeared, fixed high above the Palatine, shining as if to mark his ascent among the gods. The river flowed on, carrying reflections of torchlight and destiny alike. The empire slept beneath the weight of its creator's silence. Peace remained, but it felt colder now, less divine, more enduring. For though Augustus was gone, his shadow still stretched across centuries, teaching the world that power, once born, never truly dies. It only learns to speak in quieter tones. When Augustus died, Rome did not mourn loudly. It whispered. The city, draped in black and gold, seemed to breathe in unison, as though afraid to break the perfection he had left behind. Statues of marble watched from every corner, faces serene, eternal, indifferent. The Senate gathered in solemn ritual, proclaiming the dead emperor divine, his name fixed among the constellations. But beneath their measured voices lingered unease. Who would fill the silence he had left? The marble he built gleamed in the sunlight, but its whiteness hid cracks beneath. The Republic had vanished, the Empire was born, and now it waited to learn what kind of god would rule its heart. Tiberius, his stepson, took the mantle, reluctant, stern, and already weary of worship. He had lived too long in the shadow of greatness, and that shadow followed him into power. The people looked to him for another Augustus, and found instead a mirror of restraint. His rule began not with fireworks, but with caution, measured decrees, deliberate stillness. Yet beneath that composure lurked suspicion, as if every smile were an accusation. He trusted no one completely, not even himself. Where Augustus had ruled through light, Tiberius governed through shade. The city that once danced in applause now moved in whispers, adjusting to the rhythm of a colder peace. In the early years he governed well, restoring order, securing borders, listening more than he spoke. But Rome, accustomed to theater, mistook his silence for cruelty. The Senate, unsure whether to flatter or fear, chose both. Senators praised him in words that trembled with self-preservation. The poets who had once gilded Augustus's reign fell silent or fled. Even the gods seemed to retreat into their temples, their altars burning lower. The empire's calm endured, but its warmth had gone. Rome had entered a new age, one of caution, of glass smiles and careful eyes. The wolf was still sleeping, but her dreams had grown darker. Tiberius withdrew from the city more each year, retreating to his island villa on Capri. There, cliffs rose like sentinels against the sea, and wind carried the sound of eternity in restless waves. The emperor watched storms roll across the horizon, their fury distant yet familiar. He preferred the company of silence, a silence that fed both thought and paranoia. Letters from Rome reached him daily, filled with flattery and fear disguised as politics. He read them all, burning those that praised too strongly. The empire ran itself now, a machine built on inertia. The Senate obeyed out of habit, the people lived out of necessity, and Tiberius ruled through absence. Rumors began to fill the spaces where his voice once lingered. They spoke of cruelty, of hidden chambers, of an emperor losing himself to shadows. Whether true or imagined, they grew like vines, twisting truth into legend. Rome had always needed a story, and when no hero remained, it created monsters. Yet even in his exile, Tiberius maintained a strange order. Taxes collected, armies disciplined, laws enforced. His rule was not chaos, but stillness, and stillness left too long begins to rot. What Augustus had shaped into marble was turning back into clay. The gods perhaps were laughing, for every golden age ends not in fire, but in boredom. When word came of Tiberius's death, the city did not grieve as it once had. It exhaled. The Senate declared him divine, but their prayers were hollow. The people returned to the games, to their noise and hunger, as if shaking off a long winter. The old emperor was buried without spectacle, his name spoken with the tone of necessity, not reverence. Yet beneath the surface, his reign had changed Rome forever. He had proved that the empire could survive without charisma, without faith, without love. It could live indefinitely on momentum alone. That was his unspoken legacy, that the machine no longer needed the maker. That night, the Tiber glimmered under starlight, calm and indifferent. Rome slept, dreaming of grandeur it no longer questioned. The marble walls whispered softly in the wind, their echoes carrying the memory of two men, one who had built eternity and one who had endured it. The empire was whole, yet hollow, radiant, yet cold. Above the city, the stars burned with divine patience, watching as history inhaled again, waiting for the next voice to fill the silence. For in Rome, silence never lasts. It only prepares the stage for another storm. The empire glittered like a mirage beneath the endless Roman sun. From the Palatine's crest, the roof shone with polished tile, and every temple caught the light as if the gods themselves had descended to dwell in stone. Travelers who entered through the great gates felt awe before fear, their footsteps swallowed by the hum of trade, prayer, and ambition. Augustus had promised a city of marble, and his heirs had kept that illusion alive. The air smelled of iron and incense, of flowers laid at shrines and of dust raised by chariots. Rome appeared eternal, yet eternity here was surface, light stretched thin across weariness. Beneath the splendor, slaves labored, soldiers drilled, and silence pooled in the cracks of monuments. Beauty had become a mask too heavy to lift. Artisans carved the faces of emperors onto walls and coins, giving order the comfort of familiarity. Statues lined the avenues, each gazing toward infinity with practiced serenity. Painters gilded ceilings with myths that flattered power, blending gods and rulers into a single lineage of perfection. Every fountain whispered harmony, every arch declared triumph. Yet the more flawless the city became, the more fragile it felt. Marble preserved form but erased memory. Its cold surface forgot the hands that built it. The empire had learned to polish time, to disguise decay beneath polish. Rome, once alive in motion, now held its breath in beauty, still as a portrait too perfect to be real. In the evenings, torches lit the forums with a golden hush. Senators in embroidered robes crossed marble floors that echoed like distant thunder. The air was thick with perfume, rhetoric, and calculation. They spoke of peace, but their eyes betrayed the hunger for legacy. The Senate had long ceased to rule. It performed remembrance, repeating gestures once born of conviction. Decrees flowed like ritual offerings, each sentence crafted to please a throne unseen yet omnipresent. The emperor's will traveled through them like unseen wind through reeds. They called it duty, the poets called it destiny. But the gods, if they listened, remained silent, content to watch their reflection gleam and fade. Beyond the city walls, the legions stood as borders made flesh. Fortresses dotted the frontiers from the Rhine to the sands of Syria. There, discipline replaced devotion, and obedience became faith. The soldiers believed the marble world behind them eternal, even as they watched its shadows lengthen across the plains. Letters from home carried tales of games, festivals, and endless prosperity. They read them beside fires that smelled of rain and steel, smiling at the illusion of permanence. Yet they too began to sense the pause in history, the strange quiet between breaths. Empires, like men, grow most vulnerable when they feel most secure. Rome's perfection was beginning to sound like prophecy, whispered backward. At dawn, when the streets lay empty and the fog touched the columns, Rome looked young again. Birds nested in the statues of gods. The river moved softly beneath the bridges like thought beneath sleep. In that stillness, one could almost believe the city was breathing, dreaming of itself. But dreams cannot hold forever. Each sunrise revealed another crack hidden by gold leaf, another whisper swallowed by ceremony. The Augustan dream was not peace, it was suspension, a moment stolen from decline. And as the marble cooled in the morning air, the empire's pulse beat on, steady, magnificent, unaware that every monument it raised was already rehearsing the shape of ruin. Beneath the empire's shimmer, its architects worked as if shaping the breath of gods. They built not for years but for centuries, each arch and column a wager against oblivion. From dawn to dusk, hammers struck rhythm into the air, echoing like a heartbeat beneath the city's calm. Marble dust clung to their skin, turning men into pale ghosts of their own creations. They did not speak of beauty, they served it. The foreman measured every stone as though the future depended upon its balance, and in truth, it did. For in Rome, perfection was no longer art, it was law. The empire's promise of eternity demanded obedience from even the smallest chisel mark. Every hammer blow was both worship and warning. In the great baths of Agrippa, steam curled through vaults higher than trees, pillars carved to imitate forests, frozen in dream. Citizens wandered through corridors of water and light, their voices softened by marble that heard everything and repeated nothing. The aqueducts stretched for miles, rivers of discipline disguised as grace. Architects traced geometry with devotion, their diagrams a theology of stone. Yet among them crept exhaustion, the quiet dread of creators who knew they were building not for joy, but for preservation. To make something eternal is to deny the mercy of change, and the builders of Rome had forgotten rest. Even their shadows seemed designed, perfect, deliberate. Poets too became architects, shaping memory instead of marble. Virgil, Ovid, and Horace wrote lines meant to outlast empires, their verses gilding the age with the illusion of control. They spoke of Rome as destiny fulfilled, of Augustus as the chosen center of history's wheel. Their poetry breathed order into chaos, yet between the verses lingered weariness. They knew that eternity is a fragile word. It lives only as long as someone repeats it. When Ovid was exiled to the edge of the Black Sea, his letters carried a different tone, loneliness polished into philosophy. He had praised perfection, only to learn that perfection exiles the imperfect. In his sorrow, the empire's marble began to sound like silence. Artists painted ceilings as heavens tamed by symmetry, their pigments glowing under lamplight. Mosaics rippled across villa floors, tiny fragments forming divine illusions. Every household sought reflection in art, every noble patron his likeness immortalized. The empire had turned its gaze inward, its creativity looping back upon itself like a serpent in gold. What had once been worship had become repetition. Yet in repetition lay an odd tenderness, an unconscious fear that if they stopped creating, the city itself might vanish. So they carved, painted, built, and rebuilt, chasing eternity with trembling hands. The beauty they made was sincere, yet their sincerity had begun to taste of desperation. Outside the marble glow, craftsmen, slaves, and soldiers carried the burden of these dreams. They quarried stone under sunless skies, dragged columns through mud, lifted ceilings higher than their own hopes. Each monument required nameless hands, and those hands vanished into history. The emperor's name endured, but the sweat of his builders dried unrecorded. In this silence, the empire revealed its truest symmetry between divine vision and human erasure. The architects built temples to gods, but they themselves became ghosts before the paint had dried. And still they worked, for Rome's promise of immortality demanded sacrifice that could never speak its own name. At dusk, when the scaffolds emptied and the last echo of hammer faded, the city glowed in the half-light, like a memory rehearsing itself. The workers walked home through streets they had built but could never own. The poets dined with patrons, their compliments measured, their smiles precise. The marble reflected torchlight, making the city appear both alive and petrified. The Augustan dream persisted, luminous and hollow, floating between miracle and exhaustion. For every dome raised against time, a soul was spent beneath it. Rome did not see. Rome never looked down. Eternity was beautiful, but it was heavy. The more flawless Rome became, the more it seemed to tire of its own reflection. Beauty, once pursuit, had turned to obligation. Every street, every column, every mural demanded reverence. To live in the empire's heart was to breathe art until one could no longer taste air. Perfection weighed upon the people like invisible armor, glittering, suffocating. The marble gleamed too bright beneath the sun, the gold too heavy upon temples. Even joy grew formal, rehearsed in the amphitheaters where laughter was cued like prayer. Beneath the surface hum of abundance, restlessness began to stir. The empire had achieved everything, and in that achievement it began to forget why it had ever tried. The artists no longer painted from wonder, but from memory. Their brushes repeated the gestures of masters long gone, each stroke precise but empty. Sculptors carved gods that all looked alike, faces serene, eyes lifted to nothing. The patrons who once sought beauty now sought only reassurance, commissioning portraits that promised immortality while they aged in quiet dread. Art had become a mirror of anxiety, a delicate scream hidden in marble. The city's galleries and villas glowed with perfection, polished too smooth to feel. Rome still believed in eternity, but eternity had grown cold to touch. The wolf's descendants no longer hunted, they posed. In the palaces, the aristocrats floated through corridors of luxury, their sandals whispering across mosaic floors. Their words drifted toward philosophy, but their hearts beat for novelty. Foreign perfumes, rare spices, exotic pets from lands barely known. Banquets became contests of indulgence, conversations dissolved into flattery. Musicians played songs designed not to move, but to distract. The empire's wealth had finally conquered discomfort, and with it, meaning. Even the air felt curated. In gardens perfumed with jasmine and myrrh, philosophers debated virtue while slaves trimmed the roses. Rome's soul, once sharpened by hunger, was now dulled by abundance. And abundance, unguarded, is the beginning of decay. Temples multiplied like echoes, each more ornate than the last. The priests performed rituals with mechanical devotion, voices echoing through incense-thick air. Faith, once fierce and private, had become public theater. The gods received their sacrifices on schedule, as though divinity itself obeyed bureaucracy. Offerings were weighed and recorded, omens interpreted by pattern, not by awe. Rome prayed not for salvation, but for stability. And in that endless repetition of worship, belief began to hollow. The gods who had once been feared became predictable, their power diluted by routine. When thunder rolled across the hills, no one trembled. It was merely weather now. The common people felt the strain most of all. They lived beneath monuments that did not belong to them. In the shadows of grandeur they could neither escape nor claim. Bread was plentiful, but purpose was scarce. The game's once rare celebration had become daily distraction. Gladiators bled not for honor, but for spectacle. The crowd cheered as if to drown the sound of its own emptiness. In the evenings, torches flickered across the Colosseum's arches, illuminating faces that wanted only to forget. The wolf's hunger had turned into the crowd's applause, loud, rhythmic, endless. The empire had taught its children to sleep with eyes open, dreaming of triumphs they would never see. Yet in quiet corners, among scholars and dreamers, questions began to stir. They spoke softly of decline, not as rebellion, but as confession. Could perfection endure without the imperfection that gave it meaning? Could peace survive without struggle? The wisest among them saw the answer written in stone, cracks small as threads spreading across monuments. Time was returning, disguised as beauty's fatigue. But Rome was not ready to listen. The empire had mistaken stillness for strength, silence for harmony. It had forgotten that marble, no matter how polished, still crumbles under rain. At twilight, when the day's light softened the city's sharp edges, Rome looked almost human again. The scent of smoke rose from hearths, blending with myrtle and sea wind. The statues glowed amber, their frozen expressions gentled by shadow. For a few moments the empire exhaled, its perfection blurred, its heart almost visible. But dusk is merciful only to those who know it ends. The lamps were soon relit, the marble reclaimed its shine, and the illusion resumed its reign. The weight of perfection remained unseen, but its shadow stretched long across the night. The cracks in the marble began as whispers, hairline fractures on columns, soft dissonance in song, a hint of fatigue in the sculpted smiles of gods. At first, Rome ignored them. The city had lived too long in brightness to imagine shadow could return. But beauty, once wounded, cannot heal, it only hides. Slowly, the empire's harmony began to sound rehearsed, its perfection brittle. Even the sunlight seemed thinner, the gold on temples fading beneath layers of dust. The Tiber flowed heavier, slower, carrying reflections that rippled and broke like old memories. Rome, the city that had conquered the world, now trembled beneath the weight of its own reflection. The artists were the first to notice. They painted skies that looked tired, carved faces with eyes half closed, as though divinity itself were weary. Frescoes darkened, pigments thickened, and symmetry gave way to tension. The beauty that once proclaimed order began to confess its exhaustion. In their art, the architects of eternity had started to speak of endings. They did not know it, but they were recording prophecy, the slow transformation of pride into fragility. Their colors dimmed, their marble yellowed, their gods softened into memory. The empire had grown old, though no one dared name it so. In Rome, to admit decline was the only sin left. The Senate still gathered, but its debates had become ceremony, words spoken to satisfy ghosts. Senators praised the empire's strength, even as they feared its silence. Each decree sounded like a eulogy disguised as command. They spoke of reform, while their eyes measured the floor. The emperor's face, carved into coins, stared blankly from every palm, a symbol of control that no longer needed conviction. Rome had learned the art of survival through appearance. The citizens believed because disbelief required courage, and courage had long gone extinct. The marble walls stood, but the ideas that built them had already turned to dust. Among the common people, unrest moved like a quiet fever. Bread was still given, games still played, yet laughter felt thinner. The crowd's cheers echoed longer than they should, as though filling a hollow space. Gladiators fought not for glory, but for distraction. Their deaths were met with indifference. The empire's heart beat slower, but louder, heavy and mechanical. The wolf, once wild, had been tamed into ritual. In taverns and marketplaces, rumors drifted like smoke, of corruption, of famine, of ghosts walking near the forum. Still, life continued. Rome did not know how to stop. Decline had become routine. In the villas of the wealthy, decadence deepened into isolation. They dined under painted ceilings of eternal blue, pretending the world outside still adored them. Musicians played softly, their melodies thin as candlelight. Servants moved through the halls like shadows, silent and invisible. Philosophers were invited for company, not wisdom, their words absorbed as decoration. Every room glittered, yet none felt alive. The empire's elite lived inside their own reflection, mistaking stillness for serenity. The walls of their homes were lined with faces, portraits of ancestors who seemed to watch, disapproving, from within the paint. The living were surrounded by the dead, and the dead were winning. Yet amid this slow unraveling, the city remained magnificent. At dusk, Rome still blazed like a jewel beneath the heavens. Its domes caught the dying light, its streets pulsed with movement, its towers stood proud as memory. From a distance it looked eternal, an illusion so perfect even time hesitated to break it. But illusions, like gods, demand devotion, and devotion was fading. Faith no longer burned in hearts but lingered only in ceremony. The marble shone, but its veins had begun to split. The empire's perfection, once armor, now served as its shroud. When rain finally came, it fell not as blessing but revelation. The water streaked down the statues' faces, tracing tears into stone. It gathered in the cracks between cobblestones, carrying with it flecks of gold, fragments of fresco and dust from forgotten triumphs. The scent of wet earth rose, a reminder of what Rome had buried beneath centuries of pride. The people watched from under their awnings, quiet, uneasy. For the first time in generations, they felt the pulse of the world beneath the marble, raw, restless, alive. The gods were not gone. They were only changing faces. That night, thunder rolled across the hills, soft and distant like footsteps approaching. The lamps along the Tiber flickered in the wind, and the river's surface turned black, swallowing the city's reflection whole. Rome slept beneath the storm, dreaming of its own perfection, unaware that the dream had already begun to end. The Augustan illusion, so radiant, so complete, had finally met the mirror of decay. Beauty remained, but its breath was gone. The empire would wake again, but never as it had been. The marble would stand, but now it would remember that it could break. Morning rose over the Colosseum like a curtain lifting on eternity. The sun spilled through arches of stone, gilding the sand where silence waited to become noise. Crowds poured through the gates, their voices swelling like a living tide. The empire had learned that fear could be soothed by spectacle, that hunger could be forgotten with applause. From the highest marble seats to the dust-stained benches of the poor, all eyes turned toward the arena. Trumpets blared, drums rolled, and 100,000 hearts beat to the same rhythm. This was not merely entertainment, it was ritual. The games had become the empire's heartbeat, the theater through which Rome pretended it still believed in glory. Behind the curtains, gladiators prepared as priests before sacrifice. Oil gleamed on their arms, masks of iron hid their prayers. They did not fight for freedom anymore, they fought to keep the illusion of Rome alive. Trainers whispered last commands, slaves swept the sand smooth, and the smell of blood from yesterday lingered beneath the perfume of incense. When the gates opened, the roar of the crowd swallowed their fear. The first clash of steel was a hymn, the first cry, a sermon. High above, the emperor raised his hand, an effortless motion that decided life or death. The people called it mercy. It was theater's final trick. The games began at dawn and ended with sunset bleeding through the arches. Between the battles came pantomimes, dances, and mock sea wars, where ships crashed upon artificial tides. Rome had turned its memory into performance, repeating the myth of conquest until it felt true again. The Senate financed the spectacles, claiming generosity. The people accepted, calling it gratitude. Bread was distributed at the gates, warm and soft, while beneath the bleachers, beggars gnawed on crumbs that fell through cracks. The empire fed its body with grain and its soul with noise. Peace endured, but it smelled faintly of exhaustion. In temples not far from the arenas, priests echoed the same rhythm. Incense curled upward, thick and sweet, blurring the faces of statues. Faith had become choreography. Incense at dawn, sacrifice at noon, blessing at dusk. The gods no longer demanded belief. They required attendance. Citizens offered prayers with the same automatic grace with which they applauded the games. The empire had united religion and entertainment, devotion and distraction. Even the high priests kept time with the arena's drums, their chants blending with the crowd's cheers. Rome did not worship anymore. It rehearsed its faith, perfect and hollow, until the echo sounded divine. At night, when the crowds dispersed and the torches flickered low, the arena stood empty under the moon. The sand, darkened by blood and shadow, lay still. A breeze moved through the arches, carrying faint echoes of laughter, grief, and song. The same wind passed through temples, lifting the smoke of dying candles. From the Palatine Hill, the emperor looked down upon the sleeping city, its lights trembling like stars drowned in fog. Rome appeared eternal once more, flawless and obedient. Yet beneath the marble, beneath the music and prayer, the wolf's breath stirred again, low and restless. The theater of power had become the empire's soul, and the soul was beginning to forget how to feel. When daylight returned, it arrived with trumpets. Across the city, banners fluttered like tongues of fire, and the smell of roasting meat filled the air. It was a festival day, one of many that blurred into each other until every week felt like celebration. Rome no longer marked time by harvests or seasons, it measured it by spectacles. The people dressed in bright dyes and garlands, carrying idols of their favorite gods as if escorting friends to a feast. Vendors shouted above the din, selling charms and talismans promising fortune. The empire had found its new religion, not belief, but belonging. And nowhere was that devotion deeper than in the shadow of the Colosseum, where divinity and entertainment were indistinguishable. The emperor entered to thunderous cheers, his chariot gleaming with gold leaf and sunlight. He wore the robes of Jupiter himself, his crown shaped like flame. To the people, he was no longer ruler, but conduit, a man through whom the gods chose to speak in gesture and performance. He lifted his hand, and silence rippled outward, vast and reverent. Priests followed, scattering petals, chanting invocations that dissolved into applause. Sacrifices bled at the altar, white bulls toppled, their blood pooling in bowls of bronze. The smell mingled with incense and sweat until holiness felt tangible. The games began, not as violence, but as liturgy, Rome praying to itself, blade by blade. Beneath the stands, gladiators waited in the cool dark, listening to the crowd above. Some whispered prayers to Mars, others to Fortune, but most prayed to the emperor, whose favor had become more potent than heaven's. They had seen comrades raised from servitude to celebrity, and others erased in a single gesture. Fame and death walked hand in hand through the corridors. The men did not fear dying, they feared dying without applause. When the gates opened, sunlight cut through the dust like revelation. Trumpets cried. The first fighters stepped into the glare and became gods for a heartbeat. The crowd rose, roaring not in cruelty, but in worship of spectacle. The arena thundered as animals burst from cages. Lions from Africa, bears from the Alps, tigers from lands beyond maps. Chariots collided in silver flashes, dust swallowing the outlines of men. The emperor watched, serene, his eyes half closed as if in meditation. Each act of death below reflected his own authority, graceful, measured, absolute. When a victor stood over a fallen foe, all eyes turned upward for judgment. A turn of the emperor's wrist decided eternity. The people screamed in ecstasy when mercy was granted, and screamed louder when it was not. In that chaos, cruelty lost its name. It had become communion. Outside the amphitheater, the priests kept pace. New temples rose to honor emperors alongside gods, their statues indistinguishable in grandeur. Hymns praised Caesar and Jupiter in the same breath. The sacred flame that once burned for Vesta was now guarded by soldiers in gilded armor. Divinity had been domesticated, brought into politics, bound to the empire's vanity. Faith was spectacle, loyalty its doctrine. The old gods, perhaps weary, allowed it. After all, worship is worship, no matter who receives it. Rome believed it was praising eternity, yet eternity was quietly leaving the stage. As twilight fell, torches ringed the Colosseum like stars fallen to earth. The crowd, drunk on triumph and spectacle, poured into the streets. They sang songs of empire, their voices hoarse from joy. In taverns, men reenacted battles with wine cups for shields. Children played at being gladiators, their laughter echoing down the alleys. Even the beggars smiled that night, fed on scraps from the feast of gods. Rome was united again, by noise, by blood, by belonging. It was peace, or something that looked like it. The wolf slept once more, not in hunger but in indulgence, and in its dreams she tasted the sweetness of her own decay. As years turned, the games grew larger than belief itself. What had once been ritual now devoured meaning. Amphitheaters rose in every province, their arches copying Rome's colossal circle of sand and stone. From dawn until dusk, the roar of crowds echoed across continents. The empire united not by law or language, but by entertainment. Festivals lasted weeks, and the people forgot how to live between them. Even mourning became theatrical, processions scripted, grief rehearsed. Rome no longer worshipped gods to feel divine, it worshipped itself to feel alive. The empire had become a single vast stage, its citizens both audience and actors, performing eternity for one another. The emperors understood this and wielded the stage as their throne. They paraded through the city in golden armor, scattering coins to the crowds like blessings. Each gesture, each smile was a line in a play that never ended. They promised order, but their rule was choreography. Statues multiplied in their image. Poets recited hymns to their glory in forums that trembled with flattery. Rome had turned politics into pageantry and faith into applause. The Senate clapped from habit, the people from hunger, the soldiers because they were paid to. Power had discovered its most perfect disguise, spectacle. It did not need to be believed, it only needed to be watched. In the amphitheaters, cruelty reached the height of art. Exotic beasts tore men apart to orchestras of drums and flutes. Entire naval battles were reenacted in flooded arenas where ships clashed beneath painted skies. When the crowd screamed, they did not feel horror but gratitude for being spared, for being entertained, for being part of something vast and unending. Mothers covered their children's eyes only to pique themselves. Fathers raised their fists and shouted for blood. Death became another performance, the ultimate confession of Rome's faith in dominance. Even suffering had been made beautiful, shaped into choreography under the emperor's gaze. The poets of the age no longer wrote of virtue or gods, they wrote of spectacle. Their verses praised the emperor's generosity, the perfection of the games, the magnificence of the crowd's devotion. Words that once sought truth now served silence. To write honestly had become dangerous, and danger itself had been turned into entertainment. The empire did not burn her thinkers anymore, she applauded them to death. Even philosophy was reduced to performance, discussed at banquets between sips of wine. Stoicism, Epicureanism, virtue, all were ornaments for conversation, ideas polished until they reflected nothing. The mind had joined the body in servitude to spectacle. In the quiet edges of the empire, provinces watched Rome's glow like distant firelight. They imitated its rituals, built smaller arenas and worshipped the same illusion. Governors paraded as miniature emperors, cities staged their own festivals of blood and joy. Yet the farther from Rome the echo traveled, the hollower it became. The empire's greatness no longer inspired reverence, it demanded imitation. Its culture spread like light through fog, dazzling but cold. In its brilliance, local gods dimmed, local tongues fell silent. The empire was becoming everywhere and nowhere at once, a dream repeating itself until meaning dissolved. As night descended, torches lined the streets like veins of fire. The city pulsed with noise, but its heartbeat was mechanical. Musicians played in taverns, lovers whispered beneath marble porticos, priests chanted to gods who no longer listened. From the Palatine Hill, the emperor looked upon the shimmering chaos with quiet satisfaction. Below him stretched the illusion of unity. Gold and stone, laughter and violence, peace and decay all woven together. He knew that so long as Rome kept watching itself, it would never notice the cracks forming beneath its feet. The empire of spectacle had achieved its purpose, to make decline indistinguishable from celebration. At dawn, the arenas were washed clean. The blood was gone, the sand smooth again, the marble gleaming beneath sunlight. The workers swept the stands in silence, the echo of applause still hanging in the air like smoke. The city stretched and yawned, ready to perform another day. For Rome, there was no difference between living and acting anymore. The stage had become the world, and the world was beginning to forget the script. In time, the spectacle began to devour its makers. Emperors who had once staged divinity started to believe it. Palaces turned into sanctuaries, courtiers into worshippers. Statues of rulers rose beside Jupiters and Apollos, their features softened into the calm of eternal command. The crowds chanted their names as prayers, their portraits appeared on household altars, and incense was burned to their memory while they still lived. What began as flattery became creed. Rome, once skeptical, now surrendered to the comfort of worshipping power. The gods had grown silent, and men filled the silence with themselves. Even the emperors who doubted their own holiness learned that divinity was safer than humanity. Domitian was one of those who wore the mask until it fused to his skin. He ordered his subjects to address him as Lord and God. In public, his presence was ritual, his words prophecy. Statues of himself lined the avenues, polished so brightly that they caught the sun and blinded passers-by. But the light was thin, untrustworthy. Behind closed doors, he paced the marbled floors, hearing footsteps that were not there. Paranoia became his priest, fear his constant sacrifice. When at last his own servants struck him down, the city felt no surprise, only relief. Rome had learned again what it always forgets, that idols once worshipped must also be broken. After Domitian came emperors who ruled through fatigue rather than faith. They kept the games alive, but the cheers grew fainter, rehearsed out of habit. Bread was still distributed, temples still crowded, but devotion had turned to dust. The gods felt far away, the emperors smaller, the marble colder. In the markets, people spoke of omens, of strange lights over the sea, of stars falling like sparks from extinguished fires. Some said it was nothing. Others whispered that the gods had grown weary of Rome's theater. Faith, once choreographed, began to fragment into superstition. Beneath the arches where victory was once carved, beggars now slept. Philosophers retreated to gardens and libraries, writing quietly of reason while the streets outside trembled with rumor. Stoics spoke of virtue, Christians of salvation, Epicureans of withdrawal. Rome had become a crossroads of belief, every idea a torch flickering in wind. The empire still called itself eternal, but eternity had begun to multiply into doubts. The old gods lingered like faded murals, their faces chipped and patient. They had been fed on sacrifice, on devotion, on spectacle, and now they starved. The citizens still lit candles, but fewer each year. They were tired of worshipping mirrors. In the amphitheaters, the crowd sat longer before cheering, waiting for emotion to arrive. The sand beneath their feet had absorbed centuries of blood, and even that had begun to lose its meaning. The performers looked to the stands and saw indifference. When the emperor gestured, the roar that followed sounded hollow, as if the city were imitating itself. Rome's voice was becoming echo, its power, repetition. The empire had perfected the art of performance so thoroughly that reality itself began to feel like a forgotten script. The gods, once sculpted in glory, now looked like actors who had missed their lines. At twilight, the priests closed the temple doors and listened to the wind moving through the pillars. It made a low, steady sound, neither word nor song. Some thought it was the river, others said it was the gods leaving in silence. The incense burned low, revealing cracks in the altar stones. Pigeons gathered on the roofs of sanctuaries unbothered, replacing the eagles that once symbolized power. The sky above Rome glowed purple and gold, the same colors used for imperial robes. Beauty remained, but it felt accidental, unclaimed. The city had become magnificent and faithless, radiant and restless. When night came, torches flared along the Tiber's banks, reflecting twin fires on the water. Rome still sparkled, still pretended to breathe, yet beneath that glow was an emptiness too vast to ignore. The people slept, dreaming of games that no longer thrilled them, of gods who no longer listened, of rulers who no longer ruled. The empire had reached the edge of its own perfection and found nothing beyond it. The hollow gods stood motionless in their temples, their eyes of marble wide and blind. The wolf no longer dreamed of glory, only of silence. The night it began, the air was too still. Over the rooftops, a strange red shimmer trembled like dawn caught between breaths. Then came the crack, wood splitting, tile shattering, the gasp of fire finding air. Within moments, the city was alive again, but not with life. Flames leapt from street to street as if guided by unseen will, devouring timber, banners, and prayer alike. The Tiber reflected the blaze in waves of molten gold. People poured from their homes clutching what they could carry. Idols, scrolls, children, silence. The roar of the fire became Rome's new anthem, the old songs of triumph replaced by the hiss of collapsing roofs. Even the statues seemed to flinch as their shadows twisted in the light. At first, no one believed it could happen. Rome was marble and destiny, too vast to burn, too divine to fall. But fire does not worship, and it does not discriminate. It ran along the narrow alleys, leaping through markets and temples, climbing from the Forum to the Palatine. The heat warped the bronze of gods and melted the faces of emperors cast in stone. Smoke rose like incense too thick for heaven, choking the sky. The smell of cedar from temples mingled with the stench of grain stores and flesh. The people cried out to every deity they remembered, but the gods were silent, perhaps watching the city's purification with the indifference of eternity. As chaos spread, rumor grew faster than flame. Some said it was an accident, others whispered that it was command. In the darkness of panic, blame became religion. Fingers pointed toward Nero, the emperor who had inherited both an empire and its restlessness. They said he watched the fire from his palace, lyre in hand, singing of Troy's destruction while his own city burned. Perhaps it was true, or perhaps it was the kind of story that history writes when truth feels too small. What mattered was not the act, but its echo. Rome had always needed an image, and now it had found one. A ruler playing music as the world turned to smoke. By the third day, the flames had swallowed the Circus Maximus and half the city's hills. Families camped along the riverbanks, their faces lit by reflections of their own ruin. Soldiers formed chains with buckets. Priests dragged relics through the streets, shouting blessings that dissolved into coughs. Nero rode through the chaos surrounded by guards, his expression unreadable. He promised rebuilding, offered gold, swore devotion to the people's pain. Some believed him, desperate for direction. Others watched the glow in his eyes and saw something colder than guilt, fascination. For emperors, destruction was another form of creation, and the fire to Nero might have been simply a stage. When at last the flames died, Rome was unrecognizable. The hills stood black and skeletal, the air heavy with the scent of ash and rain. Smoke drifted through what had once been streets, curling around fragments of statues, charred doorways, collapsed arches. The silence after was unbearable, a silence too vast for mourning, too complete for hope. The survivors wandered through the ruins, touching stones still warm, whispering the names of their dead. Children searched for fountains that no longer flowed, and yet amid the devastation something ancient stirred. Rome had been broken before, and each time it had risen harder, colder, wiser. The wolf does not die. She adapts. Nero, ever the performer, vowed to rebuild the city in perfection. He spoke of symmetry and fireproof stone, of avenues wide enough for air and light. Architects obeyed, laborers toiled, and from ruin rose marble again, whiter, smoother, emptier. The city regained its shape, but its memory changed. Where once faith had built temples, fear now built monuments. The fire had burned more than wood and stone. It had burned certainty. The people still prayed, but they prayed differently. Quieter, warier, as if afraid the gods might actually answer. Rome had survived, but not unchanged. From its ashes emerged a strange reflection, the beauty of order born from chaos, and the philosophy of endurance written in smoke. In the ashes of the burning city, one man sat apart from the roar of rumor and rebuilding. Seneca, old now, thin as parchment, watched the smoke drift over the horizon like memory refusing to fade. He had served emperors, tutored Nero, and endured the burden of seeing wisdom twisted into weapon. His house still stood, though charred at the edges, the walls stained with the breath of fire. He did not rebuild. Instead, he wrote, lines carved not for approval, but for survival. What cannot be controlled, he whispered, must be endured. Around him Rome screamed, but his pen moved in silence. Stoicism had become more than philosophy. It was armor. Seneca's words spread through the city like small lights in the dark. They reached merchants who had lost everything, mothers who had buried sons, soldiers who had seen the marble burn. Fortune, he told them, is a river, not a wall. You do not stop it. You learn to float. His calm felt heretical in a city addicted to spectacle, yet it gave people something the gods no longer did: perspective. In his teachings, pain was no longer punishment, but teacher. Loss was no longer failure, but proof of being alive. Where faith had once soothed the people, reason now offered them quiet dignity. Rome had learned endurance through empire, but now it was learning it through thought. Nero, hearing the whispers, felt the sting of defiance. He had wanted philosophy to be ornament, not resistance. For him, Stoicism was a pose, something recited, not lived. But Seneca's influence reminded the people that serenity was stronger than fear, that silence could be rebellion. The emperor's paranoia thickened. He saw treachery in reflection, conspiracy in stillness. He summoned his old teacher, demanding loyalty disguised as gratitude. Seneca bowed, but his eyes did not. Power, he said softly, is not control of others. It is control of oneself. Nero smiled thinly. Within the week, an order arrived at Seneca's home. The philosopher was to die, by his own hand, in peace. The story of his death became legend. He greeted the soldiers calmly, as if receiving guests for dinner. His friends wept, but he comforted them with philosophy, reminding them that fear was the most painful illusion. He opened his veins without tremor, speaking as blood fled his body. "We are waves," he murmured, "returning to the sea." His last breath was not plea, but lesson, a man teaching composure to the end. Nero's cruelty had silenced a voice, but not its echo. The empire that no longer knew how to pray had witnessed a new kind of divinity, courage without gods, peace without mercy. After his death, Rome whispered Seneca's words like prayers. His scrolls passed from hand to hand, copied by scholars and slaves alike. They read them at night when the wind carried the faint smell of ash from the ruins. "No fire," he had written, "consumes virtue." It became mantra, then prophecy. The philosophers who followed took his calm as rebellion, his restraint as weapon. Stoicism spread through barracks, through schools, through hearts weary of chaos. Even those who did not read his work felt its rhythm, a quiet defiance beneath the empire's thunder. In a world ruled by spectacle, his stillness became the truest form of power. Meanwhile, Nero sank deeper into the labyrinth of his own myth. Surrounded by flatterers and fear, he mistook performance for truth. He ordered statues of himself to replace those of forgotten gods, demanded poems praising his voice, decrees celebrating his divinity. But even the crowds who had once cheered began to falter. Their applause sounded brittle, uncertain, as if echoing from hollow stone. For every shout of loyalty, a whisper of mockery followed. The emperor's stage had turned against him. The world he had built of mirrors now showed only his reflection, distorted, endless, alone. When the end came, it came quietly. Nero fled his palace under moonlight, disguised, trembling. Behind him, Rome breathed in relief, exhausted by years of indulgence and fire. In a borrowed villa, surrounded by servants too afraid to speak, he realized what every tyrant learns too late, that fear buys obedience but never faith. As soldiers closed in, he pressed a dagger to his throat, whispering the same words he once mocked. "What an artist dies in me." The empire did not mourn him. It exhaled. For the first time in years, the air smelled clean. Fire had taken the city. Philosophy had survived it. At dawn, the ruins glowed pale under the new sun. The Tiber carried reflections of both destruction and renewal, its current indifferent as always. Rome, stripped of pretense, began to move again, not in triumph, but in rhythm with mortality. Stoic teachers filled the forums, their calm voices echoing between broken columns. They did not promise salvation, only understanding. The empire had learned through flame what it could not learn through glory. That endurance, not victory, is the truest form of greatness. The city that had burned was not rebuilt from marble alone, it was rebuilt from thought. In the years after Nero's fall, philosophy rose like quiet smoke over the ruins. The Senate debated again, but its words were tempered by memory. The people no longer shouted in the forums, they listened. The empire's pride had been scorched, and what remained was reflection. Scholars gathered in porticos, their voices soft against the clatter of daily life. They spoke of stoicism, of endurance, of reason as refuge. Rome, once a city of conquest, began to admire stillness. The age of noise had ended. The age of understanding had begun. Epictetus, a former slave, became one of the new voices of the city. Born in chains, he taught freedom of the mind as Rome's last unbroken frontier. He said that a man could be imprisoned, tortured, forgotten, and still be unshaken if his soul remained his own. His students filled the courtyards, some in rags, some in silk, all drawn by the same hunger. "You have power over your mind," he told them, "not outside events." The idea spread like a contagion of calm. Soldiers carried his words to the frontiers. Merchants quoted him to their children. Philosophy had become Rome's quiet rebellion against chaos. In this new era, wisdom replaced spectacle. The amphitheaters were still filled, but their laughter sounded different. Less wild, more weary. Gladiators fought, but the crowds watched with distant eyes. They had seen too much flame to mistake violence for glory. Instead, they turned toward temples and academies, seeking meaning in endurance rather than in triumph. Stoic thought blended with fading faith, shaping a morality built not on sacrifice, but on acceptance. Even those who had never read Seneca or Epictetus began to live by their echo. Rome, the eternal city, was learning that survival is not defiance. It is patience shaped by loss. Meanwhile, a new whisper moved through the empire, a strange teaching from the eastern provinces. It spoke not of gods in marble, but of mercy, not of dominance, but forgiveness. The people called it the Way. It spread in secret, carried by travelers and slaves, by women who prayed in catacombs and soldiers who had seen too much death. They spoke of one God made human, of love stronger than empire, of truth found in humility. At first, Rome dismissed it as another superstition. But truth, like fire, spreads through silence. The same hunger that Stoicism had fed, peace through understanding, now began to find new shape in faith through compassion. Philosophy and faith lived side by side. Neither knowing it was preparing the other's crown. The Stoics had taught men to master suffering. The followers of the new God taught them to sanctify it. Together, they built a bridge from reason to revelation. In lecture halls, thinkers discussed virtue. In hidden rooms, believers sang of grace. Between them lay a quiet understanding that peace begins where pride ends. The empire had once conquered the world with iron. Now it began to conquer itself through introspection. The marble city, weary of perfection, found beauty again in imperfection. The emperors that followed learned to rule by reflection rather than fear. Vespasian rebuilt the Forum with patience. Titus completed the Colosseum as both symbol and confession, and Trajan turned war into administration. They read philosophers as their ancestors had read omens. The wisdom of ash became policy, fairness, tolerance, restraint. Even the army's banners carried words of stoic simplicity, endure and live with measure. The empire, which once demanded worship, now demanded order. Its power had become quieter, more deliberate, its ambition sheathed in pragmatism. Rome, at last, had learned to balance its pulse with its breath. At dusk, the city's lamps flickered across rebuilt avenues. The scent of smoke still lingered in the stones, faint but eternal. Teachers sat beneath porticos, speaking softly as the wind turned the pages of scrolls. Children played in the shadows of temples, where gods no longer demanded blood. The Tiber glimmered beneath the moon, carrying light instead of flame. Rome was no longer invincible, but it had become wise. Its strength was no longer in its legions or its marble, but in the quiet truth that nothing endures without humility. The city that had burned had learned to glow without fire. Twilight settled gently over the empire, and for a rare moment history itself seemed to pause. Rome had endured its fire, survived its madness, and now lived in a state of weary grace. The streets glowed with lamplight instead of flame, the air thick with the scent of rain on marble. People spoke more softly, as though remembering how easily voices can summon ruin. Markets reopened, temples hummed with prayer, and philosophers sat again beneath the colonnades, their words calmer, wiser. This was the age of restoration, not of conquest or spectacle, but of reflection. Rome had learned that the greatest victories are those fought within the mind. Emperors came and went with measured humility. Vespasian had rebuilt what Nero had burned. Trajan had extended the frontiers, but returned home unchanged by triumph. Then came Hadrian, the traveler philosopher who preferred walls to wars. He walked among his soldiers and citizens alike, writing verses to the empire's edges. He built not monuments to power, but bridges to understanding, temples for dialogue, libraries for remembrance. Under his rule, Rome learned to admire restraint. He wrote to his soul as one might write to a friend, "Be calm, be patient, be still." In those words, the city found its new prayer. The empire's peace reached its purest form under Marcus Aurelius, the emperor who never stopped questioning himself. Each dawn, before judgment or decree, he would write in solitude, letters not to his people, but to his own heart. "You have power over your mind," he repeated, echoing his Stoic ancestors. His meditations became Rome's conscience, thought carved into paper instead of stone. He ruled through discipline, not display, through mercy, not miracle. When plague swept the city and fear returned like an old ghost, he walked among the sick without armor, reminding them that courage was not the absence of death, but the acceptance of it. The philosophers of this age spoke less of the gods and more of harmony. They taught that reason was divine, that the universe itself was a living mind. The stars, they said, were thoughts of creation, the soul, a spark of the same fire. Such ideas spread quietly through households, through academies, through soldiers who carried them to distant frontiers. The empire had grown vast enough to hold many truths, and yet beneath them all lay one law: balance. Rome had finally discovered the wisdom of measure. Where once it devoured the world, now it learned to share it. In the evenings, music replaced the roar of the arena. Citizens gathered in gardens rather than games, reciting poetry under the olive trees. The sound of lyres drifted through the air, mingling with the scent of bread and myrtle. Children learned philosophy before history, told that greatness was not to rule, but to endure with grace. The city still glittered, but the glitter had softened into glow. There was no need for grand declarations. Quiet itself had become Rome's triumph. This was not the Rome of conquest or chaos. It was the Rome of reflection, aware of its own heartbeat, grateful for its own breath. Yet even peace carries its shadow. The philosophers spoke of impermanence, of how every balance bends toward motion. Marcus Aurelius knew it. Hadrian had foreseen it. They understood that calm, too, is temporary, that empires, like men, exhale before they vanish. The citizens, lulled by stability, mistook that exhale for eternity. They built gardens as if the soil could forget history, wrote verses as if time had ceased to move. But time was patient. It watched from beyond the horizon, waiting to reclaim what it had loaned. Wisdom could delay fate, but it could not erase it. At dusk, Marcus Aurelius looked out over the Danube frontier. The sky burned with orange light, clouds rising like phantom walls of flame. He stood beside his generals, quiet, weary, at peace. "All things pass," he murmured, "but nature remains." Behind him, Rome still glimmered, vast, radiant, unaware that this would be its last great stillness. The wolf that had once howled at the Tiber now rested, its fur silvered with age, its breath slow. Fire had tempered the empire, philosophy had refined it, and reflection had calmed it. Yet even in calm, the heartbeat of change persisted. History inhaled again, ready to speak. The peace that had wrapped Rome like silk began at last to fray. At the empire's borders, where the marble roads turned to dust, unease moved through the air like a gathering storm. In the north, the forests whispered in tongues Rome did not understand. Across the rivers, tribes stirred, restless, watching, learning. The legions who guarded those edges stood behind their walls, hearing in the distance the crack of unseen branches and the echo of foreign drums. What had once been the world's center now felt its circumference. Rome had grown too vast to feel its own heartbeat. Its edges pulsed with the rhythm of other hearts. The empire, perfect in reflection, was beginning to tremble in reality. Along the Rhine and Danube, the soldiers built fortresses that seemed to rise from the fog itself. They lit their fires in trenches and watched the forests for movement, each shadow a question. Their armor, once symbols of invincibility, now felt like cages. Orders came slowly from the capital, carried by weary messengers who spoke of politics rather than purpose. The commanders saluted marble emperors they had never seen, and in the silence between battles, they wondered what still tied them to Rome. For the first time in centuries, doubt marched beside discipline. The soldiers still saluted the eagle, but in their hearts, they began to envy the wild freedom beyond its wings. In the east, the deserts and mountains mirrored the unease. Parthian riders tested the boundaries, their swift horses moving like ghosts along the horizon. The empire answered with embassies, not wars, its confidence replaced by diplomacy. Trade routes stayed open, but trust grew thin. From Alexandria to Antioch, the merchants whispered that Rome's gold no longer gleamed as before. The coins still bore the faces of emperors, but their weight felt lighter, their worth uncertain. The empire's strength had once been forged in conquest, then preserved by law. Now it was maintained by inertia. Peace had turned to habit, and habit was beginning to crumble. Within the capital, the signs were subtle at first. Taxes grew heavier, harvests thinner. The forums, once filled with philosophers, now filled with petitioners. Senators spoke of loyalty while plotting escape to their villas. The people still called the empire eternal, but their voices carried less conviction. Festivals continued, but the laughter was shorter, the torches burned lower. The marble walls, so carefully polished, began to show faint cracks like veins beneath pale skin. The empire was not dying, it was aging. And aging for nations as for men begins not in the body but in the spirit. On the frontiers, the soldiers felt the weight of distance. They dreamed of Rome as memory, not command. Their letters home took months to return, if they returned at all. They lived between two worlds, the order of the empire and the wildness pressing against it. In their silence, something new began to form. Loyalty not to Rome, but to one another, to the camps, the legions, the comrades who shared their hardship. The empire's heart had splintered into 1,000 smaller hearts, beating at the edges. It still called itself whole, but unity had become geography, not belief. The emperors who followed Marcus Aurelius inherited peace without knowing how to sustain it. Commodus, his son, mistook spectacle for strength. He ruled from the arena, not the palace, fighting as gladiator before his own people. Rome, once led by thinkers, now bowed to performers. The Senate watched in silence, fearful and exhausted. Beyond the walls, the legions heard rumors of chaos and shook their heads. For soldiers who had faced storms, fire and famine, the sight of Rome's heir dressed as a hero felt like mockery. The empire's shadow had grown long, and its rulers had begun to mistake applause for authority. In the marketplaces, storytellers spoke of omens, comets, eclipses, rivers running red. Old men muttered that the gods had withdrawn again, that Rome's prayers had grown too proud, too loud. But among the younger generation, there was less fear, more numbness. They had been born into greatness and could not imagine anything beyond it. Their Rome was not a dream or a destiny. It was an inheritance slowly losing its shine. And so they carried on, trading, marrying, laughing, unaware that they were the first children of decline. For decay rarely announces itself with thunder. It begins with comfort that lasts too long. At dusk, the legions along the northern walls watched the sun sink behind forests that seemed endless. The sky turned crimson, the color of both empire and warning. Smoke from their fires drifted upward, joining the clouds that glowed like dying coals. One soldier, unknown, unremembered, looked toward the west and whispered to himself, "It begins again." He could not name what he felt, perhaps fear, perhaps awe, but he was right. Rome, the eternal city, had reached its horizon. The edges of the world were no longer boundaries, they were mirrors, and in them the empire was beginning to see its own reflection fade. The empire had become a mosaic too large to hold its own pattern. From the deserts of Egypt to the forests of Germania, distance began to outweigh devotion. Roads once kept smooth by the discipline of legions, now cracked under neglect. Couriers arrived late with news already obsolete. Governors ruled as kings in everything but name. The Senate issued decrees to provinces that no longer listened. What had been a single rhythm now stuttered, uneven and confused. Rome still called itself eternal, but the word had started to sound tired. Beneath the marble, the seams of centuries began to show, hairline fractures widening beneath the pressure of time. Civil unrest crept through the provinces like a quiet contagion. Tax collectors squeezed villages already hollowed by drought. Soldiers muttered about pay withheld. Merchants hoarded grain while preaching scarcity. The empire's heart beat faster, unevenly. In Gaul, peasants armed themselves with farm tools and called it rebellion. In Africa, governors fought over ports as if defending personal kingdoms. Every whisper of revolt was crushed, but each left a bruise. The emperors changed faster than the seasons. One murdered, another crowned, another exiled, another forgotten. The purple robe had become a curse, the throne, a knife waiting for its next hand. In Rome, the streets filled with parades for new rulers who promised renewal and vanished before the banners faded. Coins were minted with fresh faces, each emperor declaring himself restorer of peace. But the people had learned not to believe words carved in metal. Bread grew scarce, jobs vanished, temples fell into disrepair. The city that once dazzled with marble now smelled of rust and fatigue. Senators locked themselves behind gilded doors, praying to ancestors who no longer answered. The gods, it seemed, had abandoned the empire's voice, leaving only the echo of command without conviction. Rome had become a magnificent machine running without purpose, its gears turning out of habit alone. The soldiers, weary and unpaid, began to sell their loyalty. Armies crowned emperors in the fields, not in the forum. Whoever promised gold became Caesar. Whoever hesitated became corpse. Provinces shifted allegiance overnight, alliances written on sand. The legions, once united by discipline, now fought one another. Roman shield against Roman shield, eagle standard against eagle standard. The wolf had turned on itself again. For the first time, the empire's greatest threat was not beyond the borders but within them. And as the frontiers thinned, the world outside began to watch, patient, waiting for the walls to fall. In the east, Parthia grew bold again, sensing weakness where arrogance had once stood. In the north, tribes pressed harder against the frontiers, their raids turning to sieges. Yet even as cities burned, the Senate debated philosophy, and emperors staged parades. The illusion of order clung stubbornly to reality, like gilding over decay. The marble still shone, but its foundations had softened. The empire no longer expanded, it reacted. Fire was met with decree, rebellion with rhetoric. And though the soldiers still marched, their rhythm no longer sang of victory, but of endurance. Amid the turmoil, there were still moments of grace. Scholars kept writing, poets kept composing, architects kept building monuments to ideals already fading. In Alexandria, philosophers studied the stars and declared that even the heavens obeyed cycles of birth and ruin. Empires, one wrote, are constellations of men. They shine, they shift, they vanish. These words drifted back to Rome like prophecy. The emperors ignored them, as rulers always do. They believed the city eternal, not understanding that eternity requires transformation, not resistance. Rome was learning too late that survival and stillness are never the same. By night, the city's grandeur hid its fragility. The Tiber flowed quietly past broken docks, reflecting torchlight that trembled in the wind. The sound of distant arguments carried through the streets, senators blaming soldiers, soldiers blaming taxes, priests blaming time. In the slums, the poor huddled beside fading embers, telling stories of the old Rome, the golden one, the Rome of gods and glory. Their children listened, eyes wide, unable to imagine such splendor. For them, empire was not triumph. It was the slow hum of exhaustion. The marble cracked unseen beneath their feet, each fissure whispering the same word: change. At dawn, when the first light touched the city's domes, everything still looked the same, majestic, solemn, enduring. Yet beneath that calm surface, the fractures deepened. The empire no longer broke in open war, but in quiet division. The Senate remained, the temples stood, the legions marched, but none truly believed. Rome had not fallen, it had simply forgotten how to stand. The cracks in the marble were small, but through them, time began to breathe. The century turned, and with it, Rome's reflection finally split. The empire that had once called itself indivisible began to divide not from conquest, but from exhaustion. In the west, marble roads faded into forests reclaiming what had once been empire. In the east, silk banners rose beneath new suns. The Mediterranean, Rome's old heart, no longer united but separated. Provinces looked toward Constantinople for order, or to Ravenna, or to themselves. Emperors multiplied, each claiming divine favor, each ruling a fragment of what had been whole. The map that had once looked eternal now resembled cracked glass glinting under a fading light. At first the division was spoken softly, denied in decrees and ceremonies. The Senate swore loyalty to both rulers, as if unity could be preserved by word alone. Coins bore two faces, two Caesars smiling on opposite sides of empire. Messengers rode endlessly between capitals carrying orders that contradicted one another before reaching their destinations. Soldiers saluted one emperor at sunrise and another by dusk, their loyalty worn thin by travel and uncertainty. What had once been command became confusion, and confusion habit. The empire no longer breathed, it drifted, a body whose limbs had forgotten they belonged to one mind. In the east, Diocletian attempted to heal the wound by redefining it. He divided rule among 4 emperors, the Tetrarchy, a government of mirrors. It was a structure of logic, precise and rational, built to outlast the whims of men. Each ruler governed a quarter, yet each claimed the same divine mandate. For a time it worked. The provinces stabilized, taxes flowed, roads repaired. But beneath the surface of order, pride grew restless. Men do not share thrones as easily as they share burdens. When Diocletian retired, voluntarily, astonishingly, the balance collapsed. The 4 became 2, the 2 became 1 again, then many. Rome's strength had become its echo. Constantine emerged from the chaos like a vision of renewal. He promised unity, and for a while Rome believed him. His legions carried standards marked not with eagles, but with a new symbol, a cross shining above the sun. He marched from Britain to the east, defeating rivals in battles that felt less like war and more like destiny correcting itself. At Milvian Bridge, he claimed to see the sign in the heavens. In this sign, conquer. And conquer he did, not only with armies, but with faith. He bound the empire beneath a new sky, one God instead of many, one Rome reaching toward eternity again. Yet unity born of miracle is fragile. It depends on belief. The new capital, Constantinople, rose where east met west, a city of light born from exhaustion. Marble streets, domes that shimmered like dawn, harbors reflecting the wealth of 3 continents. It was everything Rome once was, and everything Rome no longer could be. From its walls, the emperor watched both worlds, the dying west behind him, the rising east before him. He ruled through faith and policy, through vision and fear. Rome had not died. It had relocated. But as the empire's soul sailed eastward, its body began to decay. The old city by the Tiber still called itself the heart of the world, though it now beat faintly, like an echo heard from another shore. In the west, the emperors dwindled into shadows. They ruled from cities surrounded by wilderness, guarded by mercenaries whose loyalty lasted only as long as gold. Roads vanished into forests, aqueducts crumbled, villas turned into fortresses. The senators who had once governed the world now governed memories, speaking Latin to empty chambers. Farmers fled to the hills, merchants bartered silence for safety. The empire's grandeur survived only in name, carved into broken arches that whispered of triumphs too distant to believe. The wolf had grown old, its fur gray, its eyes dim. Yet even in weakness, Rome refused to die. It simply forgot what living meant. Faith, the empire's final thread, began to replace citizenship. Churches rose where temples had fallen, their hymns echoing through ruins. The poor found solace there, the rich found redemption. Bishops replaced generals as voices of authority, and sermons replaced laws. The world was changing its language, its rhythm, its gods. The cross had conquered the eagle, but victory carried melancholy. For in uniting heaven, Rome had divided earth. The old gods retreated into legend, their temples silent under ivy and dust. The empire had won eternity but lost presence. It now existed more in memory than in stone. At twilight, along the Tiber's banks, the city glowed faintly. Still majestic, still proud, but quieter now. The sound of forges had faded, replaced by bells from distant churches. The marble gleamed with the last light of day, its cracks gilded by sunset. Fishermen cast nets where legions once launched ships. Children played in the shadow of the Colosseum, unaware it had once thundered with gods and blood. Above them, the stars burned indifferent, eternal witnesses to the rise and decline of human certainty. Rome had divided, yet it still endured. Two mirrors facing each other across time, reflecting the same question. What is power when its echo outlives its voice? Twilight crept over the Western Empire not with thunder, but with fatigue. The skies above Rome had lost their deep blue, replaced by a dull, endless haze. The marble still gleamed where sunlight touched it, but in the corners where shadow lingered, moss had begun to claim what glory had forgotten. The roads cracked, the fountains dried, the voices that once filled the forums were now few and faint. Senators still gathered in their robes, but their debates were rituals, not decisions. The empire that had commanded continents now ruled only itself, its pride, its memories, its silence. The wolf, old and weary, lay at the gates of her own city, watching the dust of her past settle upon her paws. Beyond those gates, the horizon darkened with the movement of strangers. They came not as armies, but as migrations. Families with carts, warriors with hunger, nations without borders. The Goths, the Vandals, the Huns, names whispered like omens, pressed against the edges of Rome's fading map. They did not come to destroy what they envied, they came to share in its shadow. For even in decline, Rome still glowed with the memory of power, a promise too bright to ignore. The emperors in the West sent emissaries, treaties, gold, anything to delay the inevitable. But delay was all they could buy. The rivers froze, the harvests failed, and the frontier walls cracked under the weight of both storm and time. In the city itself, faith had replaced empire as the language of survival. Churches thrived where temples stood hollow. Bishops ruled where governors once commanded. The people no longer called themselves citizens, they called themselves believers. The gods of old had retreated into legend, their statues crumbling in gardens overrun with ivy. The cross now gleamed atop the hills where eagles had once spread their wings. Yet even faith carried exhaustion. The hymns rose daily, but their notes trembled with fear. Salvation had replaced ambition, and devotion had become the empire's last form of endurance. The emperors grew smaller with each succession. Some ruled from exile before they were crowned. Others were crowned before they were named. Ravenna became the new capital, surrounded by swamps that served as both moat and tomb. The courtiers still wrote decrees in elegant Latin, their wax seals pressed by trembling hands. They told themselves the world beyond the city still belonged to Rome, though even the messengers no longer returned. In taverns, the people spoke of a different Rome, a celestial one untouched by ruin promised by priests. The Rome of heaven replaced the Rome of earth, as if eternity could be rebuilt in prayer. When the invaders finally reached the gates, the city did not fight. The legions were gone, their armor rusted, their banners used as cloth by peasants. The sound of horses echoed through empty streets as the Goths entered, not conquerors, but caretakers of a corpse. They moved through the ruins with reverence as though walking through a dream they had inherited. They looted what gold remained, yet they spared the churches, kneeling before the same God as their enemies. For the first time in history, Rome was conquered not by foreign gods but by her own reflection. The eternal city had fallen into faith. When the fires burned again, they burned quietly. The smoke rose in slender columns, fading into a sky too grey for thunder. No one sang, no one screamed. The old monuments stood half-buried in ash, their inscriptions still legible beneath the soot. The Colosseum slept, its arches dark and hollow, its stones still warm from centuries of applause. The Tiber flowed as it always had, carrying fragments of statues and parchment toward the sea. The city was wounded but alive, dreaming of itself in fragments. Rome had become memory made flesh, a body without pulse, still refusing to die. And yet, in that ruin, something luminous endured. Monks gathered the scrolls that had escaped the fire, copying them by candlelight in mountain monasteries. Philosophers turned their reflections toward eternity rather than empire. The poor built altars in the ruins, lighting lamps where idols once stood. The faith that had ended the empire now began to preserve it, not through conquest, but through remembrance. The idea of Rome survived, floating beyond its ashes, ready to be reborn in other names, other tongues. For empires die only when their memory fades, and Rome's memory had become immortal. As dusk fell, the bells of the new churches rang over the ruins. Their sound mingled with the whisper of wind through broken arches, a dialogue between past and future. From the Aventine to the Palatine, the city glowed faintly, as if lit from within by all it had once been. No army could extinguish that light, no fire could erase its shadow. Rome had fallen many times before, and it would rise again, not in stone, but in spirit. The wolf slept at last, her eyes closed, her breathing slow. But somewhere in her dream, the sound of marching still lingered. Dawn rose over the Bosporus like a promise reborn. The sun caught the domes and masts of a new city, Constantinople, where marble shimmered as if it had never known decay. Here, the empire had been resurrected not by conquest, but by vision. Constantine, crowned in gold and conviction, stood upon the city's walls and watched the light bend across the sea. He had chosen this place not for beauty but for balance, between east and west, between old gods and new, between the ruin of the past and the faith of what was to come. Rome had moved, its body left behind on the Tiber, its soul now clothed in new light. The empire still breathed, but it was breathing differently, inhaling prayer instead of power. Constantine was no ordinary ruler. He carried both the ambition of Caesar and the revelation of a prophet. He had seen something in the sky before his greatest battle. Some said a sign, others a dream. A cross of light, suspended above the horizon, marked not just victory but transformation. In that moment, war and faith fused within him. He marched beneath the symbol, his soldiers' shields painted with it, and the world shifted. When he triumphed at Milvian Bridge, he claimed not the empire for himself, but for the God who had chosen him. His enemies saw strategy, his followers saw salvation. To Constantine, the two were the same. Under his rule, faith and empire began to weave together like threads of gold and flame. He did not destroy the old gods, he absorbed them. Temples became churches, altars were rededicated, not demolished. The statues of Jupiter and Apollo still stood, but beside them rose new symbols. The cross, the lamb, the halo of divine light. The empire was learning to speak a new language of eternity. In the Senate, the name of Christ was spoken cautiously, then reverently. Priests replaced oracles, bishops replaced augurs, and the emperor himself became bridge between heaven and earth. Rome, once ruled by divine myths, was now ruled by divine certainty. The people, weary of idols and endless wars, embraced the new faith as if it were peace itself. The churches filled with voices that trembled not with fear, but with hope. Hymns rose through incense-thick air, echoing against the domes like wings unfurling. For the first time in centuries, Rome no longer worshipped power, it worshipped purpose. And yet faith too became empire. The bishops argued over doctrine as senators once argued over law. Councils convened like courts. The same precision that had built roads and armies now shaped belief. The empire had changed its gods, but not its nature. It still demanded order, still sought eternity, still feared the silence beyond its borders. In Constantinople, the streets were wide and radiant, lined with colonnades that caught the sea's reflection. The city felt both ancient and new, like a dream remembering itself. Here stood the basilicas, vast and solemn, where sunlight poured through high windows and turned dust into gold. Scholars copied the scriptures beside scrolls of philosophy. Soldiers knelt before battle as if before history. The new capital was not an imitation of Rome, it was its metamorphosis. The empire had shed its skin of marble for one of faith. It had found a second life, though it did not yet know that second lives are shorter. Constantine walked through his city as both builder and believer. He watched its towers rise and its markets fill with the tongues of every province. He ordered crosses carved on gates, mosaics of heaven laid into floors, and fountains built in the shape of eternity. Yet beneath his grandeur lay unease. He had united a fractured world, but unity is a fragile miracle. Old priests cursed him in whispers, soldiers questioned his piety, and philosophers wondered whether empire could survive faith's gentleness. Still, Constantine pressed forward, believing that power could serve divinity without corrupting it. He did not see that the two, once joined, could never again be separated. At night, he stood upon the sea walls, watching the moon ripple across the dark water. The wind smelled of salt and smoke, carrying echoes from the ruins of old Rome. Somewhere beyond the horizon lay the past, the pagan temples, the broken eagles, the eternal city now fading into myth. He closed his eyes and prayed not for victory, but for clarity. The sea answered in silence. He had built a city for eternity, yet even eternity felt fragile beneath his hands. For all his faith, Constantine remained a Roman, still haunted by the same hunger that had driven the empire since its birth, the desire to make mortality last. In the years that followed Constantine's vision, faith ceased to be a whisper. It became decree. The cross that had once marked shields now marked laws. Edicts carved on stone declared that the old gods would be tolerated, but no longer trusted. The empire, once woven from 1,000 spirits, began to learn the discipline of one. Churches multiplied, rising beside the ruins of temples, their bells replacing the cries of oracles. Rome had not abandoned divinity, it had reorganized it. The same order that once governed armies now governed salvation. Faith had become administration, and salvation citizenship. The empire's soul no longer marched beneath banners of conquest, but beneath doctrine written in gold. For many, this new world felt luminous. The poor found dignity in shared belief. The weary found rest in mercy. Slaves could pray beside senators, and their voices carried equal weight before heaven. For the first time, a God had promised Rome forgiveness rather than glory. The catacombs emptied, and their candles rose into cathedrals. But not all hearts welcomed this transformation. The philosophers, heirs to Stoic calm and ancient thought, warned that unity born from creed could turn to division. Faith, they said, was flame. It could warm or burn. Yet their voices faded under hymns and incense. Rome's reason had yielded to revelation. The empire was learning to dream again, though this time it dreamed in scripture. In Constantinople, bishops gathered like generals, their debates thunderous as battles. They argued over mysteries, the nature of divinity, the shape of truth, each seeking words to contain what could not be contained. Constantine presided not as scholar but as emperor, his gaze steady, his purpose political. He needed faith to unify where blood no longer could. He declared the council's decision sacred, and the sacred became law. Heresy was no longer difference, it was treason. The empire had found a new language of obedience. The swords of soldiers defended borders. The words of priests now defended heaven. Rome's conquest had entered the invisible. The old gods lingered, patient in their decline. Their temples stood half-used, their statues half-worshipped. Farmers still poured wine to forgotten deities before harvest. Sailors still whispered to Neptune before setting sail. Pagan Rome did not vanish. It slowly turned to shadow, absorbed by the new light. Even in cathedrals, traces of the old faith clung to marble. Sun motifs, laurel wreaths, the gestures of ancient blessing. The empire was not reborn, but repainted. The gods had changed their names, but not their thrones. Jupiter slept beneath the altar of Christ, and in dreams he smiled. Constantine's successors deepened the transformation. Under Theodosius, the temples were finally closed, their doors sealed with wax and decree. Statues of gods were shattered or baptized into new meanings. The Vestal flame, which had burned since the founding of Rome, was extinguished by imperial order. The silence that followed was immense. The people gathered outside the temple, not in protest, but in awe. They did not understand that a chapter of the human spirit had ended, that the sacred fire which had once guarded the city was now replaced by faith in unseen flame. The gods did not curse, they simply withdrew. The empire had changed its heart, and the heavens changed with it. Yet faith, like empire, breeds its own divisions. As the cross replaced the eagle, new rivalries took root, not of land, but of belief. Heretics, schismatics, ascetics, visionaries, the empire filled with factions that worshipped the same God, yet saw different reflections. Councils condemned what sermons inspired. Bishops exiled bishops. Emperors excommunicated their own kin. The dream of unity began to fray into argument, and the empire, now built on revelation, trembled under the weight of interpretation. Rome had learned to worship truth, but truth once spoken demanded infinite voices. In the streets of Constantinople, the faithful marched beneath icons while philosophers turned away in quiet despair. The chants that once praised Caesar now praised Christ, yet the rhythm was the same. The people still adored power, though its face had changed. Processions replaced parades, relics replaced trophies. The empire had traded empire for eternity, conquest for conviction. And though the banners no longer bore the eagle, the shadow of Rome still stretched across the world. Faith had conquered what force could not, but in doing so it inherited the same curse, immortality without peace. At dusk, the basilicas glowed like lanterns of heaven, the air filled with the sound of choirs and bells, rising over the murmurs of the sea. Constantine's dream had become law, his city, the new axis of the world. Yet somewhere, in the silence between hymns, the empire's old hunger stirred again, the longing to control what cannot be controlled, to name what cannot be named. For in the heart of every empire, even one baptized in light, there waits the shadow of its own beginning. The cross shone above the city, gleaming against the sky like a sword turned upward, and the world, for a moment, believed that light could last forever. The world that Constantine had dreamed into unity soon began to divide again. Faith had brought order, but order built on revelation is delicate. Too much light can blind. In the decades after his death, his heirs inherited both empire and burden. Councils multiplied, each more urgent, each more uncertain. Emperors became arbiters of eternity, their thrones draped in theology as much as silk. From Antioch to Alexandria, the streets filled with processions of believers chanting rival truths. Rome had replaced the roar of legions with the murmur of prayer. But even prayers can clash like swords. The empire that once conquered through discipline now fractured through devotion. The echo of unity was fading into argument. In the West, faith became fortress. The old city, wounded but proud, found solace in ritual. The Bishop of Rome, now called Pope, rose quietly above the ruins of empire, claiming authority not from armies, but from memory. His robes gleamed where armor had rusted. When the senators disappeared and emperors fled, he remained the last figure of continuity in a world of collapse. The people turned to him as they once had to Caesar, seeking order in his blessing. From his seat among the shattered temples, he spoke of heaven as the new Rome, eternal, unseen, unbreakable. And though he wielded no sword, his words reached farther than any legion. In the east, Constantinople glittered like a second sun, radiant yet restless. The emperors there called themselves guardians of both empire and faith, but power and piety were uneasy companions. They built churches vast as mountains, Hagia Sophia, a dome lifted by light itself, while in the streets below heretics were exiled, scholars silenced, rebels crucified. Each generation of rulers sought to define truth through decree, as though heaven could be bound by empire. The faith that had united now began to divide, Greek against Latin, mystic against rational, East against West. The same cross that once brought peace now split the world into mirrored certainties. Monks fled from the noise of doctrine into the wilderness. In deserts, forests, and mountains, they carved silence into stone. They wore rough robes and lived on roots, chasing the divine in solitude. Their cells became new temples, their prayers new libraries. They wrote by candlelight, preserving not only the gospel but the wisdom of the ancients. Aristotle, Plato, the poets and physicians of forgotten ages. The empire's strength was fading, but its memory was being saved in the ink of men who had renounced it. Thus, in the humblest corners of decline, eternity was rewritten by hands stained with dust. The common people, caught between bishops and emperors, learned to survive through faith's simpler rhythms. They prayed for rain, for mercy, for bread, for peace. Their belief was not in councils or creeds, but in endurance. They filled churches with tears, lit candles against plague and famine, and found in their poverty a kind of holiness. The new Rome, the Christian Rome, was no longer a city but a state of mind. Its empire was measured not by land, but by the reach of hope. The stones of the old forums crumbled, but the psalms rose higher. The gods of war were gone, and in their place stood saints of compassion, their legends brighter than any victory. Still, shadows remained. The emperors of Constantinople, surrounded by gold and incense, began to drift into the same arrogance that had doomed their ancestors. They debated the color of angels' robes, while barbarians gathered at the gates. They crowned themselves with divine titles, forgetting that divinity does not bargain with pride. When earthquakes struck and fires swept the harbors, they saw punishment where there was only nature and responded with prayer instead of preparation. The walls still stood, but the spirit behind them faltered. The empire had grown old again, this time not from war, but from certainty. Far to the west, the echoes of faith grew stronger as the echoes of empire faded. In monasteries of Ireland and Italy, bells rang over green hills where legions had never marched. Monks wrote, sang, and prayed, their chants crossing centuries like waves. They copied books that would one day rebuild knowledge word by word, like the slow beating of a heart refusing to stop. These quiet outposts became Rome's true heirs, not its generals or senators, but its scribes and dreamers. They held the light through centuries of dark, and when at last the world was ready again to remember, it would find Rome waiting, not in ruins, but in thought. At dusk, Constantinople's great dome glowed like a sun setting over history itself. The air shimmered with incense, and choirs sang of salvation that felt as much lament as triumph. From his palace, the emperor looked across the sea toward the invisible west, toward the lands that had once been Rome and were now legend. He whispered a prayer that sounded like prophecy, "Let what was divided be remembered." The waves carried it away, past the city's marble walls, past forgotten borders, into the endless dark where all empires go to sleep. Faith had outlasted Rome, but Rome had taught the world how to believe. Night fell softly upon the empire's last horizon. The domes of Constantinople shimmered against the fading light, the sea below black and silent, as if holding its breath. The world had changed beyond recognition, yet in this city, this living echo of Rome, something endured. The walls were strong, the bells rang clear, and the fires of devotion still glowed behind every window. But beneath that glow lay a quiet melancholy, a knowledge that no wall, however high, can hold back time. The empire's body had survived its 1,000 wounds, yet its soul had grown transparent, like flame stretched too thin. Still it burned, fragile, luminous, defiant. The old Rome, far to the west, now slept beneath dust and prayer. Grass grew through the cracks of the Forum, and goats grazed where senators once debated eternity. The Tiber still whispered under bridges broken and mended, carrying the scent of earth instead of empire. Pilgrims came not to worship power, but memory. They walked among ruins like monks within cathedrals of silence, tracing inscriptions half faded, whispering names no one could pronounce. The Colosseum, hollow and vast, had become a skeleton of glory, a monument not to victory but endurance. The eternal city had lost everything except the reason it had been built, to remind humanity that nothing is eternal, and that is why we remember. In the east, Constantinople carried that remembrance like a torch. Its libraries overflowed with scrolls rescued from oblivion. Its scholars spoke the tongues of gods and men. Within its churches, mosaics shimmered in dim light, saints and angels frozen in gold, gazing forever toward heaven. The empire had turned inward, trading conquest for contemplation. It no longer measured itself by dominion, but by preservation. Every manuscript copied, every hymn written, was a small rebellion against decay. The empire's strength was no longer its armies. It was its memory, its refusal to forget beauty, even as the world darkened around it. But time, ever patient, circled closer. The borders grew thinner, the provinces fewer, the treasury lighter. The emperors prayed as much as they ruled. Beyond the eastern walls, new powers gathered: Persians, Arabs, Turks, each drawn to the light like moths to a flame. The empire's defenders still believed themselves invincible, yet even faith began to sound like nostalgia. Still, the great city endured. Siege after siege crashed against its walls and fell away like waves against rock. For 1,000 years, it resisted the inevitable, living on the rhythm of miracle and memory. The cross on its highest dome gleamed through storm and smoke alike, a beacon of a civilization that refused to end quietly. In the monasteries scattered across mountains and islands, monks kept watch. Their quills scratched through the centuries, preserving words long forgotten by the empires that wrote them. Plato, Virgil, Aristotle, all survived by candlelight. These guardians of knowledge did not fight with swords, but with patience. They understood what Rome itself had learned too late, that eternity is not built of stone but of thought. When kings and conquerors rose and fell, their work remained, a pulse of light moving quietly through the dark. It was through them that the flame of civilization, first lit by Rome, never truly went out. When at last Constantinople fell, it was not the sound of collapse that marked the end. It was the silence after. The city burned as others had before it, but its ashes carried whispers rather than screams. The conquerors, standing within Hagia Sophia, looked up at the great dome and felt reverence rather than triumph. The marble still glowed with ancient sunlight. The songs of priests, though silenced, lingered in the stones. The empire had fallen, but its spirit passed into those who could not help but admire what they had conquered. And so the dream continued, reborn in other empires, other languages, other prayers. Centuries later, travelers stood among Rome's ruins, listening to the wind move through broken arches. They could not see the legions or the emperors, but they could feel their echo. Every empire since had carried a piece of that echo, a sense of order, of grandeur, of reaching towards something eternal. Rome's story had become humanity's mirror. It was not the tale of a city that ruled the world, but of a world that keeps trying to outlast itself. And perhaps that is why even now the name still glows like an ember in the dark, Roma Eterna. As the final light faded beyond the horizon, the fire that began with a shepherd's hut and a wolf's milk still burned within memory, not in stone, not in empire, but in the human need to remember, to build, to believe. The eternal city had died 1,000 times and would be born 1,000 more, each time smaller, softer, but no less bright. For Rome was never merely a place. It was a question carved into time: can we endure? And across every age, from marble to ruin to thought, the answer remained the same: yes, because we remember. The night over Rome is eternal. Even when the stars shift, when continents forget, when language itself changes its skin, that night remains, a vast, patient witness. The ruins lie quiet beneath it, washed in moonlight like bones in shallow water. The arches, the columns, the temples, broken but unbowed, stand as silhouettes of thought more than stone. Grass grows where emperors once stood. Wind moves where armies once marched. Yet within that stillness something hums, a low, timeless vibration, as if the earth itself remembers the weight of history. This is not nostalgia. It is continuity, the pulse that outlives the body, the idea that outlasts the form. Rome is gone and Rome is everywhere. To walk through her ruins is to walk through the dream of civilization. The marble may be shattered, but its fragments glow faintly, as though each piece remembers sunlight. In the Forum, weeds bloom between paving stones that once bore the sandals of conquerors and philosophers alike. The Colosseum looms above the silence, its arches empty yet alive, holding not applause, but echoes. Tourists whisper where the crowd once thundered, and in their awe the circle completes itself. The voices of history never vanish, they merely change mouths. Every whisper of reverence is an act of resurrection. Every breath drawn here is shared with centuries. For what was Rome if not humanity, studying itself in the mirror of ambition? It rose from shepherds and soldiers, from myths and mathematics, from the mingling of cruelty and creation. It built roads that outlasted borders, laws that outlived kings, words that still shape the tongues of empires unborn. But its truest monument was not its marble or its armies, it was its memory. Even its failures were fertile. Every fall became lesson, every ruin seed. From the ashes of tyranny grew philosophy, from the wreckage of conquest, compassion. The city that once devoured the world ended by teaching it how to endure. When fire came, it purified. When faith came, it transformed. When philosophy came, it forgave. The Rome of the Caesars became the Rome of the cross, the Rome of parchment and candlelight. Its legions became monks, its generals scribes, its palaces cathedrals. The empire learned to speak softly, through the hands that copied thought instead of laws. And through that quiet labor, Rome survived its own death. Its spirit passed from marble to manuscript, from senate to sanctuary, from emperor to idea. What had been command became communion. Even ruin, in time, became scripture. The centuries that followed did not bury Rome. They unfolded from her shadow. The Renaissance painted her face anew. The Enlightenment read her letters aloud again. Every courthouse built in her image, every dome that mirrors her sky, every language that carries her words is proof that she never truly ended. She is the ghost in every capital, the architect behind every dream of order. Empires have tried to imitate her and failed, not for lack of power but for lack of patience. For Rome was not ambition alone, it was attention, an empire of detail, of devotion to the rhythm between chaos and control. But even the eternal city learned that eternity belongs only to memory. Stone crumbles, law erodes, faith changes its name, yet remembrance endures. To remember is to resurrect. Each generation rebuilds its own Rome, not of marble but of meaning. It stands wherever thought reaches toward permanence, in libraries, in prayers, in the quiet courage of those who preserve rather than destroy. The idea of Rome has become our shared inheritance, the map beneath every civilization's skin, the reminder that greatness and grief are never far apart. She is our measure and our warning, our pride and our penance. In the hush before dawn, Rome feels most alive. The wind drifts through the ruins, carrying the smell of stone and rain. The first light slides across the arches, revealing moss where once there was gold. A bell rings from some forgotten church, its echo dissolving into the hum of the modern city. Cars pass where chariots once raced. Voices rise where Latin once ruled. And yet nothing has changed. The same pulse that guided legion and scholar, slave and emperor beats quietly beneath it all. History, it seems, never leaves. It only lowers its voice. Rome's greatest triumph was not its empire, it was its acceptance of impermanence. In falling, it proved that what is remembered cannot die. Each ruin is an act of defiance, each echo a continuation. The empire's lesson is carved not in conquest but in humility, that the world is vast, that time is infinite, and that to exist is to build something worth losing. For without loss, there can be no legacy, and without memory there can be no eternity. Rome's eternity is not the preservation of her walls, it is the persistence of her question. What does it mean to last? Perhaps that is why the city still feels sacred, even to those who no longer believe in gods. For here, beneath the worn arches and broken mosaics, stands proof that meaning is stronger than time. The dust of empires may settle, but the thought of them becomes light, subtle, patient, indestructible. Rome taught the world that memory is the truest monument, and every civilization since has built upon that invisible foundation. We still walk her roads, still speak her language, still dream her dream, that humanity, for all its flaws, can create something beautiful enough to outlive itself. And so the fire still burns, not in temples, not in palaces, but in minds. The eternal city endures not as place, but as pattern. Her fall was her fulfillment, her ruin, her revelation. The empire that once spanned the world now lives within it, scattered across every act of creation and every moment of remembrance. As the last stars fade above the ruins, Rome exhales again, a city dreaming within history's sleep, its flame alive in every heart that dares to build, to learn, to remember.